Now we're on. March 3rd, 9 o'clock. This is the public workshop. And I would like to call on Stan for the invocation, and Gary Wheeler will do the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise.
Let's pray. God our Father, we thank you for another day. We admit that many times we take these days for granted. We think we create them, or we simply think they pop into existence, but we recognize this morning together that they are from you, and we give you thanks for that. We ask, Lord, that in the midst of this meeting that we would make good use of this time, because you've given it to us, and we ask that you would give our leaders and all the participants wisdom, and that we would manage well the things that you have given us, not only for our enjoyment, but for those that will come after us. We thank you again in your name. Amen.
Amen.
You'll join me in the pledge, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, item 4, community development. Workshop is about the proposed proportionate share ordinance allowing developers to enter into agreements to improve roads and/or contribute toward road improvements and obtain concurrency. Bob?
Yes.
Mr. Keating, are you going to address this issue?
Yes. Good morning. I'm Bob Keating. I'm County Community Development Director, and I have to start off with the bad news that I do have a PowerPoint presentation today.
Only one, though, right?
And only one, and I will be going through that. And this is a workshop, and the intent of the workshop is to get input from the public on this proposed ordinance. I do want to tell you up front that we have talked to a lot of people on this ordinance. We've educated a lot of people on it, and we've gotten educated about it from a lot of people. So there are probably a lot of people out here in the audience today that are pretty knowledgeable about this and may have a lot of recommendations and suggestions. The topic is a draft proportionate share ordinance, and this is proposed as an amendment to the county LDRs, specifically an amendment to Chapter 910 of the LDRs. I want to start out by providing a little background. Concurrency has been in place in Florida since the legislature adopted the Local Government Comprehensive Planning and Land Development Regulation Act in 1985. Indian River County complied with the requirements of that act when it adopted its 1990 comp plan. Over the years, both the state and the county have made changes to concurrency and how concurrency is implemented. And then just last year, the state passed Senate Bill 360, and I'm going to go over that in a minute. But I think for everyone's benefit, it's good to know how the legislature envisioned concurrency back in 1985. And the Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act that since was codified as Chapter 163 of the statute said, it's the intent of the legislature that public facilities and services needed to support new development shall be available concurrent with the impacts of such development. So that's really the principle of concurrency that we've been working with all these years. I think most of you know that when concurrency was established in 1985, there were 6 facilities that were subject to the concurrency rule. Among the other things that 360 did was they added schools to that. But that, fortunately, is a topic for another day, and we're not going to go into that today, but it is something to think about. Through the years of the 6 facilities, it's really only been transportation that's been problematic. And it's been problematic throughout the state. So when we're talking about the challenges we have with concurrency and transportation, capacity and demand and improvements and capital funding and things like that, we're not unique. This is happening everywhere. Let me talk just a little bit about Senate Bill 360. First of all, it modifies Chapter 163 of the statutes. Actually, it also modifies a few other chapters, but primarily 163. As I mentioned before, it mandates school concurrency, which, as an aside, we're fortunate enough to be a pilot community for school concurrency. So the state is giving us and the school board $200,000 to prepare for school concurrency, and we're well underway with that, and we'll be coming to you soon with some of our initial products that we've been working with a consultant on. Senate Bill 360 also changes various concurrency requirements, and I'll be going into some of those soon. But it specifically mandates that local governments adopt a proportionate fair share ordinance. And Senate Bill 360, to quote it, says, "It's the intent of the legislature to provide a method by which the impacts of development on transportation facilities can be mitigated by the cooperative efforts of the public and private sectors." And that is what pertains to the proportionate fair share requirement in Senate Bill 360. And then 360 is pretty specific. It says by December 1st of this year, all local governments in the state have to adopt by ordinance a methodology for assessing proportionate fair share mitigation options. And that's why we're having the workshop today. It's why we have prepared the draft proportionate fair share ordinance. Let me first go over the concept of proportionate fair share. Generally, it starts out that with the situation we're in now, it's not inconceivable, and it's happening in some places, that proposed development projects are impacting roadways that are deficient or would be deficient if the project was approved. By deficient, that means that there wouldn't be enough capacity at the adopted level of service to accommodate the project. In such a case, a project can't go forward because the project can't pass the concurrency test. With proportionate fair share, an applicant would propose to pay his proportionate fair share of the improvement cost, and therefore the capacity could be considered available for him and he could go forward. And it does involve the board approving a fair share agreement for the project, and the project would get vested then. So that's the proportionate fair share concept. Let me go into the draft ordinance that y'all have in your packet. First of all, the proportionate fair share ordinance that we've drafted as an amendment to LDR Chapter 910 is consistent with Senate Bill 360. Now, 360 has some provisions that are mandatory and some provisions that are optional. There are some optional provisions that we actually haven't included in the draft ordinance because it was staff's position that at least one of the optional provisions wasn't consistent with the general concept and philosophy of Indian River County. We do have some other optional provisions in there, and we'll talk about that a little later. But there are also some mandatory provisions in 360 about prop share, and those are incorporated within the draft ordinance. Our ordinance is based on the model ordinance that was done by DOT. Senate Bill 360 mandated that DOT develop a model ordinance by December 1st of last year, and it did. And just as an aside, I think I've mentioned this before, DOT had asked me to be on the technical advisory committee to help write that ordinance. The consultant was Cutter, which is Center for Urban Transportation Research at University of South Florida. I did participate in that process. So actually, I probably got a little more of an exposure to 360 and prop share than a lot of other local government staff in the state did, and that's one of the reasons why we're probably one of the quickest jurisdictions out of the box with our draft. We're definitely ahead of our December 1st mandated time frame. The ordinance is also structured to be part of 910. It fits in with the rest of our concurrency regulatory scheme. So let me tell you some of the provisions of the ordinance. First of all, prop share applies only to development projects which impact a deficient link. If a development project application comes in and the traffic analysis is done and everything is fine, there's no prop share. There's no ability to do it. There's really no need to do it. Prop share does not apply to DRI projects, developments of regional impact. And that's because there's a separate provision in the statutes for prop share for DRIs. It's in another section, so DRIs can do it, but this ordinance that we're looking at adopting does not apply to DRIs. The ordinance, the draft ordinance, does require an applicant who wants to do prop share to submit an application to the county. So that's real briefly what's in the ordinance. Of course, there are a lot of specifics, a lot more detail, some of which we'll get into today, others that I'm sure will be the basis of questions that are asked. As I've implied, if I haven't specifically stated, the proportionate fair share principle really involves two components. There's a development project that an applicant wants to do, and there's a roadway improvement project that needs to be done for the applicant to go forward. So let me talk to you a little bit about the roadway improvement project and how it fits into the ordinance provisions. First of all, a roadway improvement project that's going to be one of the components of a fair share prop share agreement must solve the concurrency problems on that link. It must be a sufficient improvement that it does provide sufficient additional capacity. The roadway improvement project must be in the CIP that 360 requires to be financially feasible. Now, one of the optional provisions of 360 that is in the draft ordinance is that the board can allow a developer to go ahead with a prop share agreement even if the roadway improvement project that he needs in order to get the capacity required for his project is not in the county's 5-year CIP. For that to happen, though, the Board of County Commissioners needs to, by resolution, commit to putting that project in the CIP no later than the next regularly scheduled amendment cycle. And that it's going to need to be financially feasible. There needs to be a finding that it's financially feasible. Again, this is optional. It's something that the board has discretion on. And just to tell you, staff has put in the draft ordinance a special provision if the board wants to use that, and that's a provision that if a prop share agreement is proposed for a road that's not currently on the CIP and the board's considering committing to put that road in the CIP at the next cycle, the prop share agreement for that has to be approved at a public hearing of the board. That's one of the provisions that we've got in our draft ordinance. That's not required by 360, but I think that's the conservative approach that we've got there. And I think after I finish, Mr. Collins may want to weigh in on some of the legal aspects of this and the public hearing requirement. So let me get down to some of the specifics, some formulas and numbers. And the good news is, after I show you some of these formulas, I'm actually going to walk you through an example so you can see how they work. The proportionate fair share formula, the formula by which the amount of the prop share payment is calculated, is specified in Senate Bill 360. And really, Senate Bill 360 just points to the section in the DR that relates to prop share for DRIs. But basically the formula is we calculate the number of trips that the development project is putting on the prop share roadway. And then we divide that by the capacity increase that will be provided by the roadway improvement project. And that's going to come up to a ratio. And it might be 10%, it might be 5%, it might be 20%. But that ratio is multiplied times the cost of the project. Now, the way we've structured Senate Bill 360 says cost involves all costs. Right-of-way acquisition, design, construction, CEI. We've gone a little further than Senate Bill 360 in our draft ordinance. We have put that the cost will be the anticipated cost of the project in the year that it's going to be done, which means if it's in the 5th year of the CIP, then we have to inflate the costs for doing that. So that's just an aside, something that's not specifically in 360 that we have in our ordinance. Going back to what the real-world effect will be of one of these prop share agreements, the way we've structured the draft ordinance is when the prop share contribution is made, all of the development project's trips, not just those on the impacted link, will be vested in the system. And that's a state road, that's a Senate Bill 360 requirement. And the way we've got it in here, they'll be vested with what currently is our 5-year concurrency certificate. And of course, we have that noted in the ordinance that it'll be the 5-year certificate or whatever that changes to as we go and change our concurrency provisions after the traffic consultant weighs in with his report. But that's what's in the ordinance for vesting. Let me keep going and relate to a couple of other aspects of 360 and the draft ordinance before I run through an example. Senate Bill 360 does require that impact fee credit be given to an applicant who's doing a prop share agreement. And let me just read what it says in Senate Bill 360. Senate Bill 360 says, proportionate share mitigation shall be applied as a credit against impact fees to the extent that all or a portion of the proportionate fair share mitigation is used to address the same capital infrastructure improvements contemplated by the local government's impact fee ordinance. One of the challenges that we have in translating legislation into a local ordinance is a lot of legislation is poorly written. And actually the way this is written, the requirement is not easy to implement with the type of impact fee ordinance that we have and the type that I think most in the state have. We have a consumption-based impact fee ordinance, which means we assess an impact fee on any new development based on the amount of system capacity that it is consuming. The concept being that they're using something and they should replace that amount of something that they're using. We don't, in our ordinance, contemplate impact fee monies being used for specific roads and specific amounts. Consequently, we have come up with a formula that we have in our draft ordinance to meet this requirement. Because, as I said, it's not a perfect match for the type of impact fee system that we have. Now, you're going to have to bear with me a little bit with this formula. But, and actually, I think this would be a good point to say that my staff worked on this, particularly Stan Bowling and Sasan Rahani. We coordinated significantly with Public Works, Chris Moore and Jim Davis, and we also coordinated with Jason Brown in budget. And we all agreed that this is an acceptable formula and it's probably the best way for us to comply with the requirement of 360. To try to determine how much impact fee credit that we should give for a prop share agreement, we used the principle of we used the principle of the total vehicle miles of travel, and we're trying to establish a ratio. So we were trying to determine the vehicle miles of travel that the project is putting on the impacted link and dividing that by the project's total vehicle miles of travel to get a ratio, and multiplying that times the project's impact fee liability. And let me just tell you briefly how we calculate those. The vehicle miles of travel for the project on the impacted link will be the number of trips assigned to that link in the traffic impact analysis by the project multiplied by the length of that link. And I'm going to, like I said, run through an example and show you in excruciating detail how this works. Now, the denominator is really the same method or the same formula applied to all the project's trips. We look at all the trips assigned throughout the network and look at the length of the link that the trips are assigned to, multiply the trips times the length, and then add them all together. So basically we'll come up with a ratio, and this ratio really should show us, given the project's demand, how much of its impact fee payments really can be attributed or should be allocated to this link. If you look a little further down on this slide, we've actually put the formula for coming up with the total payment. Essentially, the applicant is going to, this is another provision we've put in our ordinance that Senate Bill 360 is silent on. Senate Bill 360 is silent on impact fees other than saying there's a credit that must be paid for impact fees with the prop share agreement. What we have in our ordinance is that when the prop share agreement becomes effective, not only does the prop share payment need to be made and the impact fee credit be given, but all of the rest of the impact fees must be paid at that time to vest the trips. And we've put this in formula format so it's easy to understand. Essentially, when it comes time for the prop share agreement to be effective, the applicant pays all of his impact fees and he pays his proportionate share. Then he gets a credit for the amount of impact fees that are related to the prop share roadway.
Can I ask a question right there?
Yes.
Please. His proportionate share, what percentage is that? Is everybody separate, or is it everybody equal?
If you give me 2 more slides, 3 more slides, when
and how much will you confuse me by the time we get there?
Actually, I'm almost done confusing.
Okay.
And I'm going to be going to the wishful thinking. Actually, let me, one more slide, I think, before I get to the example. Let me real fast tell you the procedures for the fair share process. The applicant files his application, staff's going to review the application, and if the project that he's looking at is not on the CIP, we're going to identify that. We'll draft the agreement. The board will approve the agreement or not approve the agreement. But if the project that he wants to do a prop share for is anywhere in the 5-year CIP, the board essentially has to approve the agreement in that case, because that's the mandatory part of Senate Bill 360. If the roadway project is not in the 5-year CIP, that's where the discretion comes in. Going on, the applicant, as I said, would pay the prop share amount and the balance of his impact fees, and this will vest the applicant throughout the system. Now I'm at the example part where I'm going to clarify all the confusion that I've wreaked in the past few minutes. So I've created a hypothetical project that I've named Prop Share Estates. And this project's got 500 dwelling units, and generally the trip generation is about 1 peak hour trip for each dwelling unit. We're assuming these are all single-family detached. So they're going to be about 500 peak hour trips. In this hypothetical project, looking at trip assignment, we're going to assume that there are 100 peak hour trips impacting the segment of US 1 between Old Dixie and 41st Street. And that's one of the US 1 segments that's closest to capacity right now. For today, we're going to assume that it's right at capacity. There are 70 non-peak direction trips impacting US 1. And the total traffic impact fees for this project, based on 500 dwelling units at a per unit impact fee of $5,838, would be almost $3 million, $2,919,000. Some statistics on the link. This is US 1 Old Dixie to 41st Street. The capacity out of the generalized tables right now for a 4-lane divided roadway with the number of signals per mile out there is 1860. And we're going to assume that currently it's right at the capacity. It's real close, but we're going to assume it's 1860. And that's both the traffic that we've counted out there plus vested trips. The length is about half a mile. The project that would need to be done to add capacity and serve as the prop share project would be adding 2 lanes to that segment. After the improvement project's done, the capacity goes from 1860 up to 2790. Again, that's generalized level of service table, generalized level of service manual, volume at level of service D for that type of roadway. And we're going to assume the future year improvement cost for 2 lanes on that half mile is about $3 million. Going on with the example, that developer would then come in here and say that he wants to do a prop share agreement to do that project, add the 2 lanes. And he'd like the Board of County Commissioners to add that to the 5-year capital improvements program because it's not currently on the CIP. Now, the CIP needs to be financially feasible, so in this hypothetical project, we're assuming he's going to come in and say, look, I know my proportionate share payment won't cover that total amount and won't come close, but I know another number of other developments that are going to be impacting that link, and there's a high expectation that they're going to be coming in doing prop share agreements, and that'll cover 60% of the cost of the project. And in this example, he'd be asking the county maybe to allocate 40% of the project costs from impact fees, one-cent local option sales tax, local option gas tax, some source to make it financially feasible to add this. Again, this is discretionary by the board, and there are opportunities to negotiate on this. But continuing with the example, I want to kind of, this is a slide that gets down to the specifics. I'm going to walk you through this real quick. Using the formula that's in the statute and the assumptions that are made here, the total prop share payment would be $322,581. And that's figured by taking the number of peak hour, peak direction trips that project is loading on that section of US 1, divided by the additional capacity they'll be provided. The 2 lanes will increase it from 1860 to 27, whatever. It comes out to 930. So basically, he's taken up 10.75% of the additional capacity that will be created. So that's what his proportionate fair share of the cost is, and that comes out to $322,581. when we use the VMT calculation, in this case, we take the 100 peak hour peak direction trips and add the 70 peak hour non-peak direction trips. So we're getting two-way trips, total trips that project, total peak hour trips that project's assigning to that link. And we're multiplying it times the length of that link. We're adding 170 and multiplying it by 0.5. So we're getting 85 vehicle miles of travel on that link. And we've used 930, assuming an assignment of both peak and non-peak direction hourly trips to all of the impacted links for that project, multiplied by the length of each link, and coming up with 930 vehicle miles of travel of the whole project throughout the system. Basically, we're coming up with a percentage that's pretty close to the prop share percentage, and that's what you'd expect. But that is the percentage impact fee-wise that if we were taking the amount of impact fees that he pays and we were allocating it equitably to all of the roads that he impacts throughout the county, we would allocate 9.34% of his impact fees to that. So this shows that we multiplied the 9.34 times the total impact fees that he's liable for, and his credit is $272,654. So we've got a prop share amount and we've got a credit amount. Next, we came out to the prop share final payment. We took the total prop share amount, lessed out the credit, and his proportionate share is almost $50,000. But that's not the end of it.
Before you,
We make them, the final part.
This is
Bob,
enough.
I can understand the first and the third. You lost me on the second, and I know that if you lost me, you lost other people too. The credit
And we need a
portion.
handout.
I do have some questions.
Do
And I don't know
you want to handle questions now, or should we wait?
Sure.
Go ahead.
And actually, maybe Chris Moore wants to come up and help, too. I need help, Chris.
All right, Bob, the 100 trips is from 41st Street South to Old Dixie Highway on US 1.
41st Street.
Peak hour trips?
That's peak hour, peak direction,
Okay, all right.
One-way direction.
one way. It'd be 100 peak hour, it'd be 100 northbound trips.
Okay, I'm with you on that. The 85 trips is off-peak time, but in other directions.
No, the 85 came from the 100 peak direction, the 100 northbound, plus the 70 southbound. That totals 170,
Okay,
times the half-mile
usage.
length of that link. So it's 85 vehicle miles of travel.
Okay, all right, so 2 times that would give you the peak, both lengths. Okay, all right, all right. So,
It's a shame when,
Go ahead.
when an undertaker understands this.
what's that?
It's a shame when an undertaker understands this.
He's been tutored.
What's that?
Explain it to us.
Yeah, he's been tutored, okay. All right.
All right, we're going to tutor the rest of us, too.
So, whenever you said that somebody gets vested with their concurrency of traffic impact fees, that would be a countywide vesting. And so they come in and they write us, this isn't the end of it, but so far they would write us a check for $50,000 and they'd be vested?
No. What they do, if you look at the very last part, is they essentially going to have to pay their total amount of impact fees, and actually doing the prop share is actually going to cost them money.
How would this not make our current situation worse then if they start vesting ahead of, I mean, we've got a pending ordinance in place right now to stop early vesting of impact fees. Now we've got a Senate Bill 360 ordinance coming forward that, and the way I look at that is undoing what we're trying not to do.
It does. It does. Senate Bill 360 does undo for certain projects what the pending ordinance does.
It's appropriately named 360, isn't it?
You just not figured that.
Or 180 might be good.
180.
It's Tallahassee.
Okay, any other questions at this point? Go ahead, Bob. Tell us the
Actually,
rest of the story.
The rest of the story is just the recommendation that you review this ordinance, obtain public input, and give us any direction that you feel comfortable with.
Okay. Is that
Do we have to feel comfortable?
Or that you don't feel comfortable with.
Okay. Any questions of staff or the P&Z folks? George?
That's all right. Real quick, Bob, there were just 3 factors. What is the cost inflation factor we're going to use? One of the concerns that we all face, if you look at construction in the last 3 or 4 years, I dare us to predict what 5 years out it's going to cost us. So how are we going to come up with an inflation factor?
And that's an excellent question, and we don't have in here a specific index. We're not saying CPI, we're not saying any of the other indices, so that is not specifically in the ordinance. Right now, it's going to be us coming up with an engineer's estimate of what the project would cost now, and looking at the environment and determining what the best index is used to inflate it.
I don't see how we're going to avoid this right now. I think we can wait till December and then do it if we want to, but inflation factors into the future will become very important. Is there a limit on the 5-year plan? Is there a limit? I don't understand, or I can't remember how we limit the projects. I mean, can we have 5 projects? It's a budget item, I think, but what's to prevent us from having 20 projects on a 5-year plan, or 5 projects, having a large list or a small list?
Well,
I'm sure there's a policy. I just didn't know what it was.
I think we have the projects to meet concurrency, and we've got to have either the financial feasibility to do it, and that can be through our current revenue sources. If they don't make it, then we can borrow money through bonding to do so, but we must have a financially feasible
within
5-year
a
plan.
time frame of, I understand that, so it must be a budgeting constraint, but I mean, I'm not skeptical. I just wonder if we look at all the projects in the county where we could be short in links, whether we can do them in a 5-year time frame or not. What's to prevent us from saying, let's just put them on the list and hope that someone comes forward with the money in something like this to help us along?
Our constraints haven't been money so far getting projects done. It's been the ability to get them done due to the right-of-way acquisition problems and the permitting. So in the past, we haven't financially had a problem. We may in the future. If we look in the future, we think we'll have to borrow money to do roads. We think we're going to have to do that. We're one of the few counties that does not do that at this time.
So this is something ongoing we kind of have to explain. The reason I ask is, if you're in the 5-year plan, it's going to be very difficult for us to say no. I mean, we as a county, when it comes in front of the county commission, it's going to be.
Well, that should be.
It'll become more of a policy, and which is fine. I'm just was wondering how you get on or off that list. That's all.
That should be, because in the 5-year plan, you should be trying to meet concurrency, that's what you think you'll have to expand that road to meet your future demand within the next 5 years. It should be that way.
Okay. The last one is that once you do meet adding this whole package together, once you've done the concurrency for one project increases concurrency, any project around is then it's available to everybody. How do we collect, if this other group doesn't come in, how do we collect the money from, or how do we gain advantage if one person does this?
Actually, the concurrency will not be available. What we will be doing.
If you just change that, if you change that link from 1860 to 2900 or whatever, it's not automatically available for everybody?
No, we would not be automatically changing it. It would be available just for developers that want to do proportional.
So you would only increase it as they make payment or apply, so it would go in incremental increases up to what would be the new limit?
Well, actually, we're going to have to maintain 2 sets of books.
Oh.
All right. Okay. Now we're getting more like real business.
George, and I
No.
Bob,
No, actually,
I think what you're saying is
I love it.
Must be in the new math.
We don't maintain two sets of books. You can tell we've got a planner trying to be an accountant. And,
Well, he's got everything formulated, so.
you know, what we do is we it's just like impact fee now. You have impact fee credit agreements. We record those agreements. We monitor them as a liability or where we stand. We're not going to have a double set of books.
I understand. It's incremental. That's all I needed to know, so.
And I
I
think,
can't believe that answer.
Mr. Chairman, I think
Wesley had a question.
Thank you.
I liked the questions that Mr. Hamner had, and I guess in trying to form an opinion or trying to shape this in the direction that I'd like to see it go, I would almost rather like to see it a build as you go versus a pay as you go. And that alleviates a lot of the concerns as far as the inflationary part of it that you have to build in, and that's just guessing. Not to say we couldn't get close, but that is just guessing. And the way I envision, or the way I'd like to see this work, if we could, is to, in fact, have the county join the developer, let the developer put the road in. That way we know exactly what that road costs the taxpayers, and then as other developments from around it come in, they pay us back, even if it's with interest. And that way we're getting the road done now, because as Joe said, our issue is not money
At this time.
at this time. And when it does become money, then we could have developers pay us back for monies that we may have to borrow to help improve these links that are deficient, that are affecting you and I every day.
And as I understand it, and I think Will can go into this, that's one of the decisions that the state has preempted you from making. Essentially, if the roadway project is on the 5-year CIP, there's a requirement at the state level that local government have a prop share ordinance, and the developer then controls, because the local government has to allow the developer to do a prop share agreement if it's on the 5-year CIP. If it's not on the CIP, you have discretion. You could require that it be built. That's where the decision is up to you. As an aside, I've been reading in various articles, Collier County is complaining about this very thing. Collier County wants to be able to be tougher with concurrency than the state is mandating right now. The state is mandating that local governments actually be a little more lenient with concurrency through prop share. And I don't know if Will wants to address that, but that's the, maybe he doesn't want to.
I don't think it precludes you from entering an agreement with a bunch of developers to build a road for you. I don't think,
it does not do that.
It doesn't, that doesn't, we can also do that, but that's not that will not be covered under proportionate share. It's another tool we can use, and we are working on that.
But why would a developer want to do that whenever all they have to do is strike a check and move forward?
Yeah, that's
And
Because we
if
don't
it's-
have to do the agreement automatically.
If it's on the 5-year
The
CIP.
Senate Bill 360 we do.
If it's on the 5-year CIP, we do.
Yeah.
If it's not on the 5-year CIP,
Then we can.
yes.
But, so really what we're being penalized for having a comp plan or a MPO LRTP that is working.
One of
And
the,
can be
is US
disrupted.
one on
Right.
our 5-year plan?
What's that?
Pardon me?
Is US one?
No.
No,
That's
it-
a bad example.
Right.
But,
This is an example where it's discretionary. You could opt to stop this well before we get to the calculations.
and I think my
US 1 is not on the 5-year CIP
Right.
right now. So we never have to get this far to make those calculations. You could decide up front you don't want to do a prop share with the developer because the road is not on the 5-year CIP.
So then that developer is dead in the tracks.
Correct.
And I think the whole issue on, since we're talking about US 1, was that exact question, because US 1 is a state road. Now we have a third party that we need to begin to deal with, because it's we can't demand to do things on their road.
Actually, you're correct for certain state roads, particularly, and if you read in here, and unfortunately this is why it's complex, There are several flavors of state roads. There's what's called the SIS, the Strategic Intermodal System, and most of that is what used to be the FIHS, which is a Florida Intrastate Highway System. SIS roads, you can't enter into prop share agreements unless DOT is involved.
Right.
With non-SIS DOT road, and let me just tell you, we only have 2 SIS roads in this county. All of I-95 is a strategic intermodal system roadway. State Road 60 west of I-95 is a SIS facility. We don't have any others in the county. So if it is a state, non-SIS state roadway like State Road 60 east of 95, US 1, roads like that, then DOT doesn't have to be involved in the prop share agreement. They obviously have to give us a permit to change the road.
Have a joint participation agreement and work it that way?
We can do that, yes.
Yeah. Bruce?
Yes. If I remember right in my notes, PSAC did vote unanimously on this project. In our backup, it says 4-3, I believe.
I think it was 4-3.
Really? I thought I looked at the minutes and it was unanimous.
George?
I'm not sure. Because this came before us and then was pulled at the last minute, and I seem to remember that.
George has a question about, I'm sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. No.
Following on with what Wesley said, what in your example project, what if it costs $5 million?
If it costs $5 million, there are several things. First of all, it might not be financially feasible to add it to the 5-year work program, so the board doesn't have to do it.
You're missing my point. You estimated it was going to be $3 million.
Right.
And if when it bills out, it actually costs $5 million, we the county are on the hook for $2 million.
That's correct. Once the prop share agreement is done, it is a done deal, so we have to do good cost estimation up front. Yes.
Chairman? To follow up on that, say we have several developers who come through in 1 year and want to do several different projects, and it would require this. And so we have a lot going on in addition to the 5-year plan that we put on this 5-year plan. When it comes to maintenance, we do very little maintaining sometimes of our roads, and we need to do more in a lot of areas. We take on that burden completely, right? Is that, or do they pay for the future maintenance of these roads and upkeep?
No, we pay for the future maintenance.
So that's a lot more roadway possibly we can be.
Initially, it's a brand-new road. You know, when you do usually you redo the entire road when you add that additional lane. And we have increased our maintenance over the last several years. Our resurfacing program, we've actually tripled it. And we are increasing our maintenance every year of our roadways.
Which will, depending on how many more miles we put in, how much more maintenance is going to be required. We really, in a lot of the areas, I get calls on them, that we need to stay on them. I just wanted to make sure that we understood that, the cost of that.
Bob, were you through?
No, not quite. What happens when the project is the conventional subdivision? And what happens when it's a small lot subdivision?
Actually, that distinction doesn't matter with prop share.
So essentially, a conventional or small lot is really turned into a DRI almost.
Just the opposite.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, because it said it was essentially a DRI and fully vested. And so DRI rules.
No, actually, what I said about DRIs is our prop share ordinance doesn't apply to DRIs, and DRIs have a separate prop share portion in the statutes for them.
Mr. Hammer, do you have a question?
Just real quick, Bob, on this, back to what Wesley and Bob said earlier, the only thing time is a matter of concern to everybody. If you're in the 5-year plan, forget your example, and if it is in the 5-year plan and it costs the $5 million, what is the time requirement on us to make sure that change gets made? What is within the county? How quickly do we have to put that road in? Is that the 3 years after construction we have to start? I mean, does this apply to the new rules? I mean, what are the requirements? Because I think Wesley's point is that maybe the developer can do it quicker than we, the county, and now we're talking about financing, but what is the time frame on having that road in place?
The assumption is it would go according to its current schedule in the CIP. If it's in the CIP right now for the 4th year, that means it would start construction in the 4th year.
Okay, so that would govern in the 5-year range, and then if it's
Right.
outside of that table and we allow it, then the time constraints would be determined upon allowing the proportionate share to go ahead. You'd have to set some time frame, I guess.
That's correct.
But you can contribute your proportionate fair share to mitigate the roadway deficiency by construction as well as payment. So it's conceivable that you could structure a developer's agreement where the developer would construct the road, there would be a time frame within the agreement. So there may be a lot of variations on how this gets done.
But we're not going to be able to say they must construct instead of make the payment, which is, I think, what Wesley was implying.
That's correct. Now, we do have in the ordinance that if a developer proposes to construct it, it does need to be done within 3 years, and surety needs to be posted. Those provisions are in the draft ordinance.
I think it gets back to, is it in our 5-year capital improvement plan or not? If it is in our plan, I don't think we have a lot of discretion. If they want to pay, they can pay. If it's not and it wants to be added, then we're entering into an agreement, and we can say, you build it, we'll build it, whatever the deal should be.
Okay. Bob?
Yeah, I guess there's another issue here, and that is that this, the applicant will be paying impact fees at current rates. And in your example, you have a 500-unit example. Those 500 units are not going to be built today. They'll probably be phased in and maybe built, 5 years from now, when the impact fees may be a whole lot more. So is there some possibility of saying, okay, fine, you pay your impact fees, current impact fees, but when that CO comes online, they have to pay the difference between what was paid in the past or currently and the future impact fee?
I think one of the things that's missing in this equation for the credit, and I just thought of it right now, is that we discount our impact fees by 15%. Right. So we should be discounting this 15% of the road costs because we're not including that. So I think we should have included that in the formula. That's my opinion, and I just thought of it.
Well, let me tell you, the first formula, the one up top, is specified in 360 to get the prop share amount. Now, you're correct regarding the impact fee credit. We could do the 15%, which would bring that number down.
I think we should, because that's what we do we only have 85% of our costs recouped through impact fees.
Tom, you have a...
I just want to reiterate that this is all only on those developments that are dealing with deficient links. So it is you have deficient link, then it does come before us as a Board of County Commission to state whether or not we want to put that in the 5-year capital improvement plan. So that's what all this is based on, are those developments that are coming forward that are dealing with deficient links around them.
So Joe, what you're talking about is you take 85% of the $2,919,000, and so
no,
you
actually, the other
multiply
way, you take 85% of the impact fee. The impact fee credit is $272,654. You multiply it by 85%.
It works out the same. I don't know if it works out the same way, but it's 85%, so it actually increases the amount of money the county gains by 15%.
Yeah, of a smaller amount.
Christopher?
I have a couple of general comments that tie into what's been said. Every time I read this, I think I understand it very well, and then somebody asks me a question, and I can't answer it. The mandatory provision is, I think, pretty straightforward. The road's in the 5-year plan. So I think the effect of it is you're expanding the 3-year test, that the road's got to be started within 3 years of the development, to 5 years. Because all those roads, as I understand them, are supposed to start within 5 years. So that's the effect there. I think it causes havoc, as Commissioner Davis said, with the pending ordinance. and it's not clear to me, this doesn't have to be in place till December 1st. We have a consultant coming in. Perhaps this should not be enacted until you've gone through the consultant process. You decide how you're going to deal with vesting, how you're going to deal with all those issues, and then try to fit this in as best as you can. And it doesn't have to be in place till December 1st. On the optional provision, the staff omitted one optional provision, which I think is very good. The one they put in, I have a lot of trouble with it for a couple of reasons. It takes and extends the period now, the 3-year period, to outwards of 6 years, 7 years. Secondly, you bypass the 5-year process. The 5-year process, to put a road in the plan, takes, I think, upwards of 3 public hearings. And the decision to put the road in is based on your consideration of the total transportation needs and how much money you have. I think, as George Hamner said, there's a priority here. You establish feasibility, and you decide, okay, we'll put this road in, and we won't put this other road in. With this optional provision, you jump that process for only 1 year. You've got to deal with it. You would deal with it the next year. So why are you jumping? Why would you want to jump the normal process of 3 public hearings and a consideration of the total transportation network needs? Now, the staff has put in a requirement of a public hearing, 1, and that's good. But it doesn't, it still takes this road and deals with it in isolation. And you gain only 1 year as far as the developer's concerned, because next year the 5-year plan comes up and you can consider, do we want to put that road in or don't we? If you put it in, it rolls. If you decide not to. But if you take this optional approach, then you bypass the whole 5-year plan procedures that are in place. And I even with the public hearing, I don't think it makes a lot of sense.
This is one of the reasons it didn't go to planning and zoning last month. I was having some of the same reservations about how we implement it, and it centered around the requirements of the Growth Management Act that there be public participation to the maximum amount feasible. There's also provisions for comp plan amendments to require multiple public hearings. When we delayed it from consideration by the Planning Commission, we started to go into a fairly intensive review of the Act, talk to other lawyers around the state, and tried to get some way to harmonize what appeared to be inconsistencies between entering into a developer's agreement, which would commit you to a comp plan amendment, and that public process, which took a longer period of time. And in trying to harmonize the new Senate Bill 360 with the old Growth Management Act, it was difficult. The Growth Management Act relies heavily on concurrency and levels of service, and the idea behind Senate Bill 360 seemed to be we may not have concurrency. We do have deficient links. Let's find a way to address those deficient links if we choose to do so by adding projects to our capital improvement program and having developer contributions to them. And one of the changes that was made by Senate Bill 360 was to say that capital improvement element amendments adopted after the effective date of Senate Bill 360 require only a single public hearing before the governing body, which is an adoption public hearing. What it has done is taken amendments to the capital improvement plan out of the normal process where we would transmit a proposed amendment to the state, have regional, county, municipal review, have state land planning agency review, and it allows you to go directly to an adoption hearing, which could take place after an advertisement 5 days before the hearing. Another thing that's substantially different from the existing Growth Management Act is that they've changed the definition of financial feasibility to add a sentence to say that the requirement of level of service standards, the requirement that level of service standards be achieved and maintained shall not apply if proportionate share process set forth in the statute is used. And I think that means that if you determine to make a comp plan amendment, you can't find the amendment not in conformance because of financial feasibility, meaning that level of service isn't met. And I think the intent is, if you're going to add projects through a developer's agreement and a comp plan amendment to your comp plan, you may not have all the resources available immediately, but as other developers enter into parallel developers agreements for the same link and make their contributions, the funding sources will be recaptured. But this is not the old Growth Management Act. This is a very different approach, and I think the reason level of service standards can be broken from are because you either make a finding that it's financially feasible over 5 years, or you have the ability to recover the funding over a 10-year period from other people's contributions in similar proportionate share agreements. There's some, to me, some similarity to the way utilities extensions operate right now. The county has a plan to extend its utility lines. If someone wants to develop in an area ahead of the county's plan to extend its master water and sewer lines, they can now enter into a developer's agreement to extend those lines, and they're to be repaid over, I forget whether it's a 5 or 6 year period, and the repayment comes from other people tying into those master plan lines that they put in. In other words, they upfront the cost, other people pay in, and they recover. Now, at the end of the 5 or 6 years, if they have not fully recovered their costs, then that's the end of the obligation of the county. They've taken a risk by going ahead of our normal program. I think to some extent we will be setting up an analogous program for roads where if we determine to add a link that's not on our plan now, we can structure an agreement where the developer pays for it, and the cost recovery may come from other people entering into similar proportionate share agreements in the next 5 to 10 years. Those costs go to repay the developer. If not everybody, if development stops, if there's a recession, then those funds may be at risk. Now, all of this is going to be subject to negotiation. What is the developer share? What's the public share? But a method similar to what we do with utilities, where the developer extends at their own risk, subject to other people tying in and using the same facilities and repaying him at a later date, could be explored.
I like that.
I think that's.
I like that a lot. And even if it were a situation where to take the developer off of the 5-year liability of not being paid back, I would like to. I would not.
I know. The developer, I think.
Okay, let's suppose we have a developer put in a half mile
I think
US
it
one
should
and they
be
don't
on
get paid back. I would. Eventually, we're going to need that, and we know eventually other developers are going to need that capacity. If the county joins in with a developer that may be addressing the link, gives us the opportunity to address that in today's dollars.
I think we should do the same we're doing. My position's been that all along. The Attorney's Office felt we couldn't do that for roads. But our position is that the developer should be on the line. Whoever pays them back within that 5 years, it's his risk, not ours. And because he wants to move his development ahead.
And would they get impact fee credits in the process?
Well, I just think I think that it's his risk, and we shouldn't. If the economy slows down, it's his business risk. We shouldn't take public funds, and since we moved the project ahead, and take public funds to take over that risk.
Bob, do they get impact fee credits right now?
Mr. Chairman? If I could say, nothing in this ordinance is inconsistent with that. We can do that. And actually, we can do that right now. Now, in terms of impact fee credits, Right now, our rule is a developer can get impact fee credits for an improvement only if that improvement's on the 5-year CIP. So that's where a developer can get impact fee credits.
So they can, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Gary asked if it was.
No, I was just going to follow. I agree with Will. In fact, I think I've used utilities many times in the past about what we're doing with roads and development, and going along with what Wesley just said and what Joe just said, but I think a fair way to handle that is to let the developer go ahead and put the road in, but I don't know that there should be necessarily a time limit based on when he can get his share back when other developers come in. I don't care if it's 15 years later.
Right.
He's got a stake in that. He built it, and he may lose some money because he's not getting a return on his investment. He's getting a flat price back for what the cost was, or whatever's figured at that time, but at least he'd recoup some of his investment if there was a slowdown. I don't think the county ought to step in and reimburse him, but I do believe that, to be fair, he's put that infrastructure in at his cost, and as we develop in that area, whoever comes in and develops, part of their impact fee is going to be to buy their proportionate share back into that road that's been built.
But there would have to be an end point sometime.
Yeah,
we've always years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but
Needs to be a reasonable end point.
reasonable, yeah.
Well, 5 years of it's in your plan.
What's that, Joe?
5 years of it's in your plan. We've always used 5 years, and we're trying, and I would be consistent.
What's the drawback to going longer? I don't.
Yeah, what's the drawback to going longer?
What's the drawback to going short? I mean, why is the reason?
I think Senate Bill 360 limits you to 10 years.
10 years.
I mean,
Right.
this ability to update the capital improvement plan, even if it's not financially feasible in 10 years, there's language that you can do it if additional funding sources are reasonably anticipated in a period not to exceed 10 years. So you conceivably could say any contributions to this facility over a 10-year period would be refunded to the developer.
Well, I'd like to know from Joe. Joe, why does that? What's your concern?
Well, we've always used a 5-year as a conservative approach, and what it does, it helps us. I think that's, if you're looking at someone putting it in because it's in the 5-year CIP, then they'll be paid back over the 5 years. I don't think you want that on your books forever.
Why does it?
Not on our books.
Oh, yes, it is. Because what we're going to have to do is track everything that ties in forever. I think there's got to be a time limit. We've always used 5 years consistently. We've been using 5 years in utilities and these agreements, but this doesn't really apply to proportionate share as much when you're talking about agreements to put in roads for us. That's a whole separate issue.
Right, and just to tell you, actually, you just did this recently with Mark Brackett's developers agreement for 27th Avenue. He is building that, and the developers agreement says if it goes in the 5-year work program that he can get impact fee credits. It's a little different from reimbursing him as other developers come in, but the general principle of having a developer build the roadway and maybe getting credits afterwards is doable right now with the current rules that are in place. And as I said, you just did.
I'm not necessarily looking at it as a credit. Maybe either I don't understand, I'm not being clear. If somebody's out and they spend $10 million to build a road, and over the next 10 years, other developments go in, and they pay, I guess it'd be an impact fee, but they would pay back into the cost over and above credits, whatever that developer spent for that infrastructure.
Their proportionate share.
Yeah.
But with their impact fee, you're saying, rather than.
Well, not necessarily
direct
impact
payback.
fee, because they're going over and above their impact fee to build this.
Yeah.
And if there's a cost over and above the impact fee, then the developer should be reimbursed over and above that impact fee from the new developer that's coming in, just to keep it fair.
On the proportionate share.
If you give them
Share there, yeah.
If
We
you give
could
them
use
impact fee, if you give them impact fee money back, you'll run out of money to do your other roads. I'm just telling you, if you give them impact fee credit for dollar for other ones, you will run out of money for your roads. You can't do that.
It's got to be based on.
But in Bob's hypothetical, there were 6 developers, so there would be 5 other people contributing their proportionate share, and those would be the funds going to that particular link that could go to repay the first developer, perhaps.
If you have a developer, let's just, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Christopher has been having a wave in his
I'm
hand.
totally confused. I'm the first developer.
Right.
I come in, I do a proportionate share deal. You commit to put it in the 5-year plan. It goes in the 5-year plan. Under our concurrency laws, the second developer meets concurrency.
No.
What's he going to get involved in proportionate share for?
No, he would only be able to use that concurrency if he entered into a similar agreement, paid his proportionate share as well, so that.
You say that, Will, but our law is that you include in calculating capacity roads that are in place plus roads that are in the 5-year plan. Now you stuck the darn thing in the 5-year plan.
3-year plan.
Within 3 years. Okay, so you got that issue. But putting aside that issue, Wesley, the road is now in the 5-year plan, except for the 3-year limitation that Wesley just pointed out. It's included in calculating the capacity of that road.
I understand what you're saying.
How are you
have to
holding up the
address
second developer now?
Right. Well, I mean, if Mark builds the road, and now the road's in place based on his developer agreement because he can't do it without it, then you have an adjacent, we'll just say the bank comes in now, and they're going to be utilizing some of those links. Why would the bank join in the proportionate share agreement whenever the road's already in place?
It's in place, you have to count the capacity.
How can we?
We'd have to structure it so no one can count that capacity unless they also enter into proportionate share agreement for that link that's been added.
I like that idea if it could be done.
Bookkeeping nightmare. I can understand that.
White flag.
Well, that's why we keep it to 5 years. It's not, it becomes a nightmare ongoing. That's why when we do agreements like this, we try and keep it to 5 years.
Okay.
But they're two, what we're talking right now is two different issues.
Anyone else from the P&Z?
I thought there were 5 issues.
Wait, one at a time. Mr. Hamner?
Wait a minute. I was confused because
Am
Am I on? I'm on. I was confused because there's one set of 5-year plans that I thought kind of mitigated or took care of itself. George, I think, was objecting to the addition of the option to allow the Board of County Commissioners to move ahead. Was your objection to the non-mandatory part of 360?
No, the 5-year plan's in here in our capital improvement.
But he started out way back in the beginning with a concern about an option, the option it gave, and I'm assuming that that's outside the 5-year plan because in the 5-year plan we have no option. Correct. And that was so I thought what you all were discussing was the option, and but then it kind of fell back into the 5-year plan. So
we don't have an option if we're 3 years out of the 5-year plan. We count that right now.
I confuse easily, so.
Don't we all?
I was trying to figure out what exactly we're talking about, because you have a lot more discretion in this option to do what you're talking about, Will, which would tie to what Wesley's intended, and I understand where Gary's talking about a repayment, but that would only be in this outside the 5-year plan and the option. Am I correct?
But you have to put it in the 5-year plan next year.
Oh, it's got to, that's right. If you approve it in the option, then a year later, it has to go back in the 5-year plan.
Or deficient links.
That's right, it's in 360.
That are not in the 5-year plan.
Correct.
Okay.
I think we are getting off base because we're dealing with deficient links.
Well,
for proportionate
But there
share.
are a lot of deficient links.
Well, we're talking about building roads and having a developer building roads. We're talking about deficient links with proportionate share. We've got to stick to that issue.
Well, I think when you say with proportionate share, then you're narrowing it down to just deficient links that are not in the 5-year plan.
That's it. And those are the ones that come before us as to whether we want to do that or not.
So basically,
That's the whole, I mean, you guys are.
That begs the question, how many deficient links?
May I ask a question?
yes.
Wait, I was in the middle of one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't.
The deficient links we're talking about, how many of those, are there many that are not in the 5-year plan?
There are a few. We've got a
few.
lot of them covered.
I would think that the 5-year plan would cover most deficient links.
Yeah, we do cover most of them. There are a few that are either deficient or coming close. And Chris did a spreadsheet with those recently, and it's Chris can identify those, but it's not too many.
Okay, Donna, I'm sorry.
No, I apologize. If we have a deficient link and it's not on the 5-year plan, and we have an agreement with the developer to remedy the situation by increasing the capacity on the road, does that have to go on the 5-year plan? There's an assumption here that has to go on the 5-year plan. Is that correct?
Yeah, the law says so. It's required.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
Any other questions from the P and Z folks? We're going to hold the public off for a minute. Anybody from the P and Z? Mr. Gross, did you have a question?
This is a different, it pertains to the proposed ordinance, but it is a different portion. And in the model ordinance, first of all, it is a model, and it states that no way does one have to follow it verbatim. And our proposed ordinance has followed it very closely, but in this particular incident, it did not, and I am interested as to why not. It is on page 12, second paragraph, second sentence of the paragraph 3, whereby it is the intent of this section that any required improvements be completed before issuance of building permits or certificates of occupancy. But in our proposed ordinance on page 11, paragraph 8C, the first sentence states, all developer improvements accepted as proportionate fair share contributions must be completed within 3 years of issuance of the first building permit for the project, which is the subject of the proportionate fair share agreement. So if one of them says should be completed before issuing of the building permits, it is a different philosophy, and I'm just pondering how do we rationalize that.
Bob, you have a comment?
Yeah.
The model ordinance is on page 12 of the model ordinance, paragraph J3, and it's the second sentence, which reads again, the model ordinance states, it is the intent of this section that any required improvements be completed before issuance of building permits or certificates of occupancy. And in the proposed ordinance on page 11, paragraph 8C, the first sentence states, all developer improvements accepted as proportionate fair share contributions must be completed within 3 years of issuance of the first building permit. In other words, the model says before they're issued, and the proposed says 3 years after building permits.
Again, this relates to the developer doing a project, kind of like the Mark Brackett situation with 27th Avenue. This doesn't relate to the general prop share where someone's just paying. And I think what we were looking at, and I'm not sure whether the model envisioned this, is we were looking at a pretty significant project, like my example, adding 2 lanes to a half-mile of roadway, that when you go into design, right-of-way, construction, and CEI, could easily take you 2 years. So I think we're envisioning maybe more extensive projects than the model ordinance did.
Okay. Well, I think I hear you saying it has to do with the magnitude of the project, but on the other hand, the model ordinance says all development improvements authorized under this ordinance must be completed prior to issuance of a development permit. And then it goes on to say, as I just stated, that the intent of this section that any required improvements be completed before issuance of building permits. And when it starts out by saying all developer improvements, I don't understand how we can rationalize it has to do with the size of the project.
Again, this isn't a mandate in 360, so the board could change it anyway. I think we wanted to be a little more realistic in the time it actually takes to get projects in place.
This is what I really was anticipating. It's our interpretation to be more lenient, and therefore requirements is somewhere in the future and not before the first building permit. And I wanted to point that out, that as you say, it is not mandated we have to do that, but it is a significant different philosophy. And then I'd like to conclude with the fact that the definition of concurrency has been changed, and what are we to do as far as approving or rejecting projects based upon the new definition? Has it been incorporated in the county ordinances, and do we actually use it, or when and how?
Very good question.
If you mean the definition that I read today, or
definition that was in 360, because it specifically points out there is a change in the definition.
Right.
It may on that, but I'm right now talking about the definition of concurrency. The one is as a result of 360.
Yeah,
It's right at the top of the page, I know. Here we are.
Well, we don't have it ironed.
Get it out. George, where are you at?
I'm on page 1 of, which has the title of it as the Model Proportionate Fair Share Ordinance. That's the introduction, excuse me. The definition is on page 3 under definitions, and in the commentary, it comes down to say, note that the definition of concurrency has been revised as follows, quote, transportation facilities needed to serve new development shall be in place or under actual construction within 3 years after the local government approves a building permit or its functional equivalent that results in traffic generation. So my question is, based upon that definition, do we approve or reject projects which come before us based upon that definition?
Haven't we just changed to 3 years?
Yeah, let me, okay, can I,
Bob,
let
got
me
an answer
answer
for us?
one at a time. Yeah, Commissioner Davis's question was, where is this? In your packet today.
Back.
This, if you go from the end, that last attachment's on page number 3.
Okay.
Second page, number 3.
Page number 3 from the back.
Yes, and this is commentary that's in the model ordinance. Now, and actually, let me point to your packet right at the beginning of the packet and page number 2 of the proposed ordinance. There's also included in here some changes to LDR Chapter 910 that are not part of the proportionate share ordinance, and they're right before it. And these will actually change the 3 years from CO, as it was before, to building permit.
Okay.
So that is, we're actually making that change in here right now.
You say will change, so in the meantime, that means we do not follow that definition for concurrency.
I defer to Mr. Collins on that.
Whoosh, see that buck get past?
What's the question?
What is the definition that we use for concurrency in approving or rejecting projects which are submitted to us?
Well, right now, the rule is an improvement project has to be under construction no more than 3 years from building permit. That's a change from what it was. It was no more than 3 years from certificate of occupancy.
You're saying was, but let's just say, what is it right now? What is the definition of concurrency? Don't say was. What I mean, what is?
Well, it's a double-edged answer. In our code, it's 3 years from certificate of occupancy. In state law, it's 3 years from building permit.
But have we?
No, we're changing it with this ordinance.
We are changing it with this ordinance.
Yes.
I hope so. I did not see that, but I appreciate that information.
It is on page 2 of the ordinance, right before you get.
I don't have any page 2 of the ordinance. I have 12 and 11 and 9 and a few others, but
Someone left you out, George.
Okay, are there any more questions from P&Z people or from the commission? There's a lot of people in the audience
Thank
might
you.
like to be
No,
heard.
I'm satisfied with the answer. That is clear, and I will read it here. I'll take up no more of your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gross. Okay. I see question marks over some heads. All right, is there anyone from the audience? We'll open this, no, it's not open a public hearing, it's all a public hearing. Mr. Brackett, do you have any comments?
Mark Brackett, 1915 34th Avenue. A couple of comments. I like what I hear from Commissioner Wheeler about the water sewer. Currently, as developers, if the line is not there, we put it in. If it is there, we pay a line extension fee. I think we'd have to do some work on morphing that into working with roads, but I like the idea that if the county puts in a road ahead of a developer or the developer puts in a road, there ought to be some calculation for developers that piggyback behind that to pay. 5 years is a little tight. I understand there needs to be an end date. I think I heard the county attorney say that the Senate Bill 360 says 10 years. I think 10 years is a bigger window that maybe satisfies
I like
everybody.
5 years.
Okay, imagine that. I also would like to see, and I don't know that this is possible, that there's a private sector percentage threshold that, I'm probably going to make this convoluted, but when it gets to the discretionary point, if it's not on the 5-year plan, it's a discretionary point, the board can add it or not add it. I'd like to see some language in there that if a developer is willing to meet a threshold of percentage, the board would automatically add it in. If I were to come in and say I would add 95%, I would say you'd want to say, why would we not take advantage of 95% free money? Now, I'm not proposing 95%. I said that to make my point, but I think there is a percent.
Now that we're back down to 25%.
But I think you all followed me very easily at 95%.
Context.
I think there is a percentage, and if I had to throw one out for discussion today, I'd say 50%. I'd say if a developer is willing to kick in.
We'll work with you at 90.
Well, you see where I'm going. I think it's a good
95.
point. It's a good.
It's going to depend on the funding sources, though. I mean, 70% may be okay if you've got the other 30% identified, but if you've got 5% and nowhere that you can get it from, I think you're going to have to look at it on a case-by-case basis rather than saying if private puts in 90, you're home free.
Fair enough. I just think it's something that ought to be kicked into the discussions that, if a developer is willing to step up to a point that's acceptable, and that point may be different depending on the fill-in gap afterwards, that it's an automatic. The county would add it to the 5-year plan. And again,
Staff definitely concurs. I think staff should.
The level would be up for discussion, but I think that's an appropriate discussion. I think there's some things that are obviously well thought out. I think the price increases. I think Mr. Hamner came up with a valid point. We're going to really have to dial in on what are those inflationary costs, and we need to probably be overly conservative on that so we don't end up with the situation Mr. Bruce talked about being short at the end. I think what Bob tried to explain was complicated as far as what credit the developer would get as compared to the dollars he paid. But I believe the formula was fair when you add in the 85% factor that Mr. Baird talked about, giving the developer only credit for what he's actually paying. There were a couple of changes that, and Bob, you're going to help me with this one. On 5 years, if a project is in the capital improvement plan, the 5-year capital improvement plan, funding source has been identified and it's feasible. I'm not sure. I think given that, the county would want developers to come in and join in projects already on the 5-year plan. You've already said we're paying for it. Yeah. We've identified where we're paying for. Any dollar I kick in is just gravy. Yeah. So you'd want developers to line up to do projects that are already in the 5-year plan.
And that's where we got off
Found
track,
money.
I think, Mark,
Yeah.
in a different discussion.
Okay, I thought that.
No, we're with you there.
Found money.
Keep speaking at 95%.
Okay. I heard somebody talk earlier about impact fees being paid. I think it was Mr. Bruce, and maybe the impact fee going up 5 years down the road before the houses were built. I would say that kind of takes care of itself. If I pay an impact fee today and I build the house in 5 years, I'm paying the money to the county now for trips that won't be put on in reality for 5 years from now. So you've got my money and you've got the interest, and if the impact fees go up, they just go up. I mean, you're carrying my money for 5 years for no use. That's kind of a wash.
And if I could just not dispute any philosophical things that Mark is saying, but just some factual information. The way we do concurrency now, when impact fees are paid to vest a project, they're paid at the current rates. But if the rates go up before a building permit is issued, when the applicant comes in to get the building permit, he pays that increment of increase. So we have that covered right now in our current rules.
The best of both worlds.
We do.
The increase and the interest.
Well, make up for inefficiency somehow.
You know, the developers were always willing to pay our fair share. I do
Which Mr.
think.
Brackett is that?
I do think to protect ourselves that the public hearings required should be consistent with what the comp plan requires. I'd hate to, and I do like the staff put in a public hearing requirement, but if we're required on one hand to have 3 and on this one, I don't want to, as a developer and as a taxpayer, I don't want to get in a situation down the road where everybody's agreed to something and somebody steps up and files a third-party suit and we have to start all over again. I'd say let's make it consistent and have the public hearings and get it right the first time. My last point, because I'm a little long-winded, expanding the 3 years from 5 years that Mr. Christopher spoke of, that's not exactly what would happen. Even though we would be changing to a 5-year plan as opposed to a 3-year plan now, it's not 5 years after a project's approved. Your starting date is different. I'm going to make this convoluted. The 3-year is from CO. The 5-year is from approval of the project. You would eat up those 2 years getting to CO. So it really doesn't change much. It's 3 years, 5 years, but the starting points are different, and they would approximate out to be about 3 years. So I don't think that's a big issue. But I appreciate the Commission's time. It's an important issue, and although it's complicated, I think staff's done a good job explaining it. We need to tweak it and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brackett. We're required to take a break every hour and a half, and it's an hour and a half since we started. We'll be back in 10 minutes.
Let's run this through 12:30.
12:30?
There's no voting going on. No, it's 3-1. We got Joe.
Okay, we'd like to listen to some public comments on this item.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name is John Higgs. I live at 45 Wax Myrtle Way.
Mr. Higgs?
I would like to make a few comments based upon what I've heard this morning. The first is the comment made, if I pay 95% of the cost, the road should go in. There have been roads in the history of this county, which certain members of the commission unquestionably will remember, that other people didn't want to go in. And so one aspect that we must be very careful in dealing with this ordinance is to make sure that by a back door, the public and the people are not saddled with a development that they do not want. Now, the way to do that was, I think, interestingly enough, also mentioned by the last speaker, that if you enter into the discretionary agreement, it should go through the same process of amending the 5-year plan that you would go through if you're going through it the regular way. Now, if you did that, I think you would eliminate a lot of dissension. I think that people that I talk to would be very happy with that aspect of the ordinance. I think it's very important. It also, I might say, it will eliminate what I think is a legal problem. The 360 as it is written does not, in my view, clearly mandate authorize, I should say, this contract that is binding between the commissioner and the development to go forward under all circumstances. Contingency is not met. One way to read it is that it is authorized only if there is not money for the 5-year plan or the proposed 5-year plan. Read it carefully. I think you can easily get across that is the way it's worded. It certainly is what is expressed in the memorandum from the state to us. So if you go through the process that I just mentioned, you eliminate the legal question at all, and I think you as elected officials will insulate yourself from saying there was a shotgun wedding that happened real fast and we didn't know it and I don't want this going through my living room. One small point, moving from a big point to a small point, is in the original presentation made about offsets. The point was made that the developer who is proposing the agreement is given credit for proposed developments. Now, I don't know what proposed developments are. If they haven't been approved, they're obviously in someone's mind and maybe in someone's looking forward. I think that should be carefully defined and carefully restricted, because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you have pre-approved a development which hasn't gone through any process.
I don't know where you're coming from with that.
Well, you get an end. As I heard the presentation this morning, the proportionate fair share. The developer puts up something, and it's offset by the impact fee, and it's offset by other developments in the area that will use the same road. If those other developments in the area have not been approved, and then we were not told they had been approved.
Well, they wouldn't have participated until they were approved.
That's not what I heard this morning. If that's the answer, that's the answer.
Yeah. Would you agree with that?
If you'd like me to clarify it, it's on this slide that I said that. This assumes an applicant is coming in, he's impacting a deficient roadway that's not on the 5-year CIP, and as part of going forward with a prop share agreement, he has to convince the Board of County Commissioners that it's going to be financially feasible to add this to the CIP. What I'm showing here in this assumed project is if this developer can come in and identify several other projects that are anticipated to come about in the near future, he can identify where some of the funding for that project will come.
Mr. Chairman, I rest my case.
Might come.
Right, might come. And this is,
right, it
this
sounds
is,
like.
Again, this is an assumption, and the board, when it's looking at financial feasibility, can consider whatever the developer's going to bring to the table. This is not in the ordinance. This is not in the ordinance. And you have complete discretion when it's outside of the 5-year CIP.
Okay.
Once again, Mr. Chairman,
I understand.
I did listen carefully.
Now I know where you're coming from.
And you're approving a financial agreement to change a small segment of road, and all at once you are implicitly approving a development which hasn't even gone through the P&C. You don't want to do that.
It's based on a probability that there will be other people coming on.
You want that carefully. I would think the statute should be strengthened in that regard, because
yes, if a developer came along and wanted to improve this road and we knew there was no other probability of anything happening there, well, it would die.
Okay. The last point I'd like to make is to recognize the first point that Commissioner Davis made about that concurrency is a scarce commodity. And there are fights for it now. We all know that. And our local developers do not want them to be taken up by people that have greater financial resources. This is a problem we all recognize. I think in view of that, and in view of the many questions that were raised today, the Commission should give careful thought to George Christopher's suggestion. So we have lots of time to deal with this. You have a consultant out studying an issue which is directly related to this and will be affected by this one way or the other. I would suggest that the commission wait until it gets that consultant's report, consider what it has to say, and consider these two closely related items at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Higgs. Good, very good comments. I don't think we're going to approve this today, nor in the next months or so. So we'll be going on. Yes, Joe?
When we're getting a little hum in here, and they tell me it's cell phones. Someone's got cell phones on close to the mic, and that's what's causing the background noise.
Cell phone close to the mic over here. Yes, you may ask a question, certainly.
Not you.
No. How, whenever you have, let's go back to your example that you used on this, for that segment of US 1. And they go into a proportionate share agreement, and they have a few trips that are affecting other weak links. For example, let's suppose that they have some that go north through 510 and US 1. And let's suppose that is if not a failing link, close to that they actually push this over. Would that just be a secondary participation? Or how would we just determine their proportionate share for that, and then grant them concurrency wherever they may have their trips?
As part of proportionate share, the way we have the proposed ordinance structured, concurrency has to be met on all the links. The proportionate fair share agreement would allow concurrency to be met on that link, but if the development project is impacting another deficient link, then the developer would have to do another proportionate share agreement.
Okay.
He can't leave problem links up.
Okay, so then let's suppose then that this person goes into the proportionate share on 510 in addition to this section of US 1. Then you have somebody that's got a development on 510 that is coming in to vest or to pull a building permit. We have a deficient link. That being on our 5-year plan, what would that individual do then to be able to get a building permit if there's not capacity on the 510 and US 1? Or that developer?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay,
If it's
this you have our scenario here.
Right.
That also affects a hypothetical weak link on 510. Joe comes in with Paladin whatever, and there's not capacity there because this individual that needed to do this part of proportionate share also had to do a proportionate share on the corner of US 1 and 510. Now, that pushed it up to capacity just for that one development.
Okay.
Now, what does a developer do that's in the area that now has to go through a section?
Okay, if there is a link up there, say it's a link between on 510, well, let me go back. 510 is one of those roads that's in the first 3 years of our work program, and we have specific start dates and end dates, so we're considering that capacity there for future projects.
Okay.
Say it's a US 1 link from 510 north there, and this prop share developer uses the rest of the capacity on it. The next person in, the next developer in would have to do a prop share agreement on that one.
Okay.
And then suppose somebody in Fels...
I see a domino. I mean, basically what we're allowing is somebody to vest early, and it's going to make other people join into the 5-year, or into the, it's going to have a domino effect on all the developers eventually are going to be snapped up, which again goes in face against what, never mind.
Mr. Paladin.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I'm Joseph Paladin. I'm the Chairman of the Growth Awareness Committee, and also I'm a developer here in town. I'm going to make a broad statement, then I have a couple of particular comments. The broad statement is this Senate Bill 360, and I've read it several times also, and I've read the summaries. It appears to me that probably our county is less affected by this bill, Senate Bill 360, than a lot of other counties in the state, because we've already taken on a concurrency management plan that's fairly conservative, and we're already doing most of these things. Having said that, in Mr. Keating's summary, or in his paperwork he put out, the way he brought this thing forward, I think we can, depending on what side you're on, if there is a side, But the side of the county, I think most of the wording that he had the option to put in or take out, I think you'll find that Mr. Keating took a very conservative approach to this Senate Bill 360, and it's not, leaning towards, opening the door so anybody can do whatever they want through developing. I think it's a thought-out process to where it gives him a little more of an edge to get roads built in the county, but it is a conservative approach, in my opinion. Having said that, Wesley's concern about he'd like to see a build-as-you-go and not just a pay-as-you-go. Well, basically, this really, in my opinion, gives us another tool in building roads. You take, for instance, your scenario. If a developer, say Joe Paladin or whoever comes forward, and he's going to do a developer's agreement to improve the roads along with his development, and he directly can redo improvements as far as widening 510 or whatever, and that'll correct like 4 negative links he has. But there's a negative link way out there on Highway 1 that he has one trip that it affects. With our current ordinance, he would be kept from entering into a developer's agreement and doing the roads that you want to see done because of that one negative link way out there on Highway 1 that he's affected by only one trip. With this proportionate share, as long as we have a project that you can pay into that's financially feasible, then he would be able to pay his proportionate share into that project on Highway 1, which would be probably much too large of a project for one developer to do anyway. And that would get your roads built where normally you wouldn't be able to go forward and build those roads. So this is a tool in getting roads built. And the other thing I want to say is, can I assume that under the model ordinance, Bob, under executive summary ordinance, the sentence that says, under this process, development may proceed despite a lack of adequate capacity or impact the transportation system. Basically, you've left that wording out of our summarization, right?
That's correct. There is a provision in 360 that actually allows a local government to approve a development project where the applicant is entering into a proportionate share agreement, even if he doesn't fix all the deficiencies out there. It's got some qualifying wording that the proportionate share improvements have to provide a significant benefit to the impacted transportation system. I think it's really staff, in discussing this with the attorney's office, came to the conclusion this is discretionary, it doesn't need to be in there, and I think we didn't think that that was consistent with the county's concurrency philosophy, that you want to have deficiencies that are still remaining after you approve a project that's going to affect the road with no concept of how that will ever be fixed. So we did not put that allowance in, and that's really kind of a wild card in 360.
I think that's important that you all understand that. And the other point I want to make is that under this proportionate share, a developer, and this is important, a developer can always pay more than what his impact fee allowances is, but he can never pay less. That's important. So you're not getting a break by this proportionate share. If anything, by going forward, you're going to pay more than what you would normally pay, not less. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paladin. Anyone else in the audience would like to make comment? Yes, sir, Ernie. Mr. Cox.
Good morning. It's good to see everyone again. Ernie Cox. First, I wanted to let you know that we have been, mostly Brian Seymour, who some of you have known in my office. I don't profess to understand how all these trips actually fit together. I've charged Brian and Scott Leftwich, who's a traffic consultant that's working with us. Guys, you need to understand all those details. So if you have any hard questions about trips, don't ask me. But we're engaged with your staff and working on this and going to try to make some improvements to the ordinance as we go through for your consideration. I wanted to mention a couple of those today, and then probably more importantly, a practical, how does this all work with the concurrency issue. for policy discussion. The couple of things in there, I think it probably makes sense as you're working on the ordinance to define some of the terms. For instance, segment is in the term. I think we all know what that means, but it might be helpful to put a definition that says road segment and then shall mean. And there's a couple of these discussion points that I'd suggest defining any of those terms that don't have just a natural meaning.
Good point. Very good point.
I think that'd be helpful. Second, there's a section in Senate Bill 360 that wasn't included in your section, and it relates to a long-term concurrency management system. It's actually, just to note this, and it's in subsection 16B.
What page is that on?
It's actually in the, if you look at the statute, let me see where it is in the model ordinance, is probably the easier place.
It's on page, it's the second or third page from the end of the packet, page 19.
Thank you.
Now, what was that section again, Mr. Cox?
16.
16?
16B.
There's the 16B. There's a provision in there, and I think this goes with the work that your consultant is doing too, but it talks about not only the fair share in the 5-year program, but also talks about a long-range, long-term concurrency management system and the updates. I would suggest it kind of goes back to the discussion you're talking a little bit about the 10-year program. That's worthy of discussion with your staff in terms of not only what's in the next 3 to 5 years, but what's in the next 10 years, and trying to think a little bit about maybe a longer-term concurrency management system as part of your program. And I know it's not included in the current draft that staff had done, but I think that would be helpful.
So, Mr. Chairman.
That will exceed 10 years, yeah. Go ahead.
So you're saying we have a 5-year plan, then what you're saying is create a 10-year plan then?
Not necessarily, and I tend probably the wrong lane, but it says that you've got an opportunity to have a long-term concurrency management system, according to Senate Bill 360. And I just, maybe there was a reason, Bob, that you didn't put that in there.
Yeah, and let me explain it. When you drill down into Chapter 163, over the years, the legislature has added various ways to kind of, I hate to say circumvent or get around concurrency, but to deal with concurrency. There are what's called TCEAs, Transportation Concurrency Exception Areas. There are TCMAs, Transportation Concurrency Management Areas, and another allowance, and these are all optional discretionary for local governments, is a long-term concurrency management system. Now, if you read the statute, that is an allowance that the legislature has put in to establish a longer period to meet concurrency. But there's according to the statute, there's a requirement that be used only if you have a number of existing deficiencies that you're trying to remedy over a longer period of time. But basically, the reason that we didn't put it in the proposed ordinance is we have not adopted a long-term concurrency management system. So it's in the model ordinance, and it's in 360 because some jurisdictions throughout the state do have that. Since we don't have one, it's really counterproductive to put it in.
That must be where Palm Beach County has their crawl designation.
Crawls is different. Crawls is congested roadways at lower levels of service. You know us planners with the acronym.
Yes.
And when you go around the state, you will find a lot of creative ways to get around concurrency. There's multimodal levels of service where you take into consideration transit and PED facilities. There's, like I said, the TCMAs, Transportation Concurrency Management Areas, allow for area-wide levels of service. There have been a lot of innovative ways to deal with concurrency done throughout the state. To the extent that you use these, you have to evaluate them in terms of what does that do to the quality of life, which is the basic underlying principle of concurrency. But I think getting back to Mr. Cox's question, the reason we didn't put it in there is we don't have it. If if the county wants to adopt the long-term concurrency management system in the future, would definitely put it in.
And the reason, just to follow up on that, I think it might be worth discussing, certainly with your consultants as you're going through this exercise, is to kind of follow up on the point that Mr. Paladin made, the US 1 segment that doesn't meet concurrency by one trip. And again, that's just an example, but there may be certain areas of the county that, for whatever reason, existing buildings close to the road, right-of-way deficiencies, that you might want to have a way to look a little bit longer term at certain improvements, and US 1 could be a candidate for that. And I just wanted to make the suggestion, one, I think it might be helpful in the proportionate share, but two, in terms of the work that's being done by your staff and your consultant, might be worth taking a look at certain of those areas. And then the last thing was just kind of more of an implementation type thing, and it relates to you're working on a proportionate share methodology that the legislature requires to be done by the end of the year. And I think that's a good way. Again, the objective is to get money into the system and get roads built. And this is the legislature's attempt of not only providing for that, but also trying to deal with some of the backlog that exists throughout the state. But also you've got the situation of what happens if you've got somebody that has capacity. They've gone through, they've gotten their preliminary plat approved, or they've gotten their PD. And so they have capacity today. They don't need proportionate share. But right now, even if you were to adopt, and I know today's a workshop, but if you were to adopt the proportionate share methodology a month from now, with the current pending ordinance that's in there, the person wouldn't be able to implement the proportionate share methodology because they wouldn't be at the building permit stage, and they wouldn't be able to vest their concurrency when they have capacity because they're in there. And the thing that went out today was or was discussed earlier, if you pay your impact fees today, but you might pull a building permit 3 years from now, and the impact fee goes up, you pay that difference when you pull that building permit. And the reason that you're doing that is you're putting that money for improvements into the system. And for instance, if a project is out there today that has capacity, doesn't need any roadway improvements, they pay those impact fees. The county can then use those monies anywhere else in the county that it wants to build a road, even though this project doesn't need it. But right now, with your pending ordinance, you couldn't do that. And so a suggestion that I just make, again, workshop for you all to consider, is maybe you go back and look at, I know what you were trying to do with the pending ordinance, which was we don't want phantom trips being vested before we know what the project is. Once a project has gone through P&Z and has gotten its approval, you know what the project is, and you've got somebody who's prepared to go forward with that project, make whatever improvements are needed, and pay those impact fees. Perhaps it would make sense to revisit at a board meeting in the future, changing the pending ordinance from at building permit stage, after all the infrastructure is put in, to at the stage of PD or preliminary plat when you know what the project is, because then you could get those impact fees paid and use that money in some other areas. And I think that's going to come into play with your proportionate share ordinance as well.
Okay, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
We can't spend those fees anywhere. They've got to be spent in one of three zones, North,
Right.
Central, and Southern County, and they can only be spent, obviously, on increasing the capacity of a road. But I guess kind of going along those lines, let's suppose that, and under our pending ordinance and using some of the issues that we're dealing with right now, that as an individual, I buy a lot, or as a builder, I take down 10 lots, and I get to the point where I cannot, or I'm ready to pull a building permit, but there is not capacity. Can, as a builder, I participate just on those 10 lots versus it not being the developer?
Yes.
Okay.
Quick.
So anybody, excuse me, can I?
Yes, you may.
So anybody can jump in and do this. You don't have to be, an individual can come in if I have a piece of property and decide to do this and participate.
That's correct. Essentially, as a matter of fact, this is where
No, that's not what a developer is. That's a one-time do.
But actually, if you're a landowner and you are if you are working with a potential buyer or something, and you've identified a development project, and start going through the system and do your traffic impact analysis and find a deficient link, actually this would really be about the only way for you to get entitlements on that property.
Well, I think there needs to be a caution. If you've got 10 units and you have a deficient link, is the board going to approve an addition to the capital improvement element to add that deficient link if the proportionate share contribution is going to be 10 trips out of 1,000? I mean,
it might be on the fourth or fifth year of the CIP.
No, if it's on the capital improvement plan, they can just pay their impact fees.
No?
No.
There's no deficiencies.
Oh. If there are no deficiencies, there's no problem.
Right. But if there is a deficient, if Wesley has 10 lots and he's going to, on his 10 houses, impact a deficient link, your answer was he could pay into a proportionate share agreement and go. But he could only do that if that deficient link was added to the capital improvement element, and the board may choose not to do so if it can't identify the funding sources for the other 1,000 trips that will go on there.
Except I'm saying that it might be on the fourth or fifth year of the work program where the board doesn't have to, is not in a discretionary position, it's in a mandatory position.
It's on the 5-year plan.
Right, if it's on the 5-year plan, there's really not going to be a problem.
Yeah, there is. They can't, if it's in the fourth year and it's a deficient link, he needs to do a prop share agreement to go forward.
Because we count it from year 3. I got you.
But the other funding sources are already identified.
I guess really I'm just trying to look out for the little guy, wondering if they could participate in this and exactly what the criteria would be.
And in fact, on a deficient link, for instance, that person that may have 1 lot or 10 lots, let's say the 10 lots, it's already an approved PD, but a builder owns 10 lots. If there's a deficient link by, let's say it's 2 trips, that person wouldn't have concurrency, but under the proportionate share ordinance would be able to enter into an agreement and say, I'm going to pay my fair share of that deficiency on my 2 trips that are over the link. That person with those 10 lots would be able to go forward by writing a check. Right. I think that's a good idea.
I do too.
Because you've got all different sizes. I guess just the final comment, it goes back to, and then certainly any questions anybody has, is the proportionate share deals with places where you have deficient links. And how do you deal with them? They might be deficient by 1 or 2 trips. They might be deficient by 100 trips or 900 trips. You've also got, though, in course of where you are in looking at traffic and concurrency in the county, is you've got a number of projects. We represent 3 of them, 5 of them actually right now, that have capacity today. They're all approved. They've got approved PDs. They've got capacity for the trips, but we can't pay the impact fees that could be used in those zones on other roads in order to vest and move forward. And so I know what you were trying to do with the pending ordinance, and these folks have got contracts that are going to need to either close or go away by April 1st. And so we'd love to have an opportunity to talk with your staff about perhaps a modification to the pending ordinance that wouldn't undo it. It'd still be there. People still wouldn't be able to vest phantom trips by coming in and writing a check. But these are real projects that have met all the requirements and have concurrency. There's no deficiencies. They want to pay their impact fees so they can actually put in the infrastructure, build the project.
Well, that kind of
Go ahead, because mine goes back once.
Okay.
that kind of addresses my concern, is that you have a large development on US 1 that vests now. Then if we have this in place, it's not an issue for another development on US 1, because then if somebody takes all those trips, then the next development after that enters into the Senate Bill 360. And so, I mean, it really, one person is not being left out. They just have to go a different route to get where they want to be.
That's right.
So that may be doable.
Okay. Gary?
Yeah, my comment, Bob, going back to the comment before when Wesley mentioned, builder buys 10 lots. Where's the cutoff? We protected people that had lots up to a point, but they don't have to meet concurrency. And
The age of the subdivision.
Is that 892 or
1990. Any lot created prior to that is de minimis and doesn't have to meet concurrency. We're still tracking those and putting them on our system. Yes.
Mr. Cox, you have anything further?
Thank you for your time. I look
Thank you
forward to
for coming.
continuing to work with you all on this.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much. Anyone else like to make a comment on this? Yes, sir. Mr. Swift.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Bob Swift, 2145 14th Avenue, and I am a local developer. I like the point that Ernie brought up, and it's a point I was going to make. He made it much more in a much more articulate fashion than I could, and that is that we've got a really kind of a contradiction here. We've got a proportionate share proposal that makes a lot of sense, provides an opportunity for a private-public partnership, provides an upfront funding for road improvements that are going to be necessary, and allows the business community to continue to move forward. But at the same time, we have the pending ordinance that, as Ernie pointed out, if we don't have a problem, we can't go forward. We can't pay the impact fees. We can't fund the improvements. So I would hope that we could look at linking this proportionate share with a revisit of the so-called pending ordinance, for which there is no ordinance pending, but that's another issue. There are a lot of points in here that we talked about today that would be hammered out as each project, each property owner came in to negotiate the proportionate share ordinance, the proportionate share agreement. There's nothing in here that binds you, that requires you to enter into that agreement. It simply gives you one more tool in the toolbox, and it's a very, very powerful tool. And I think you all recognize that if we didn't build another rooftop in this county, we would have issues of traffic because of the growth in the state, growth in the region, and just some of the deficient roads we have now already, regardless of the increase in population of the county. So I would urge you to keep this thing on track and move forward because it does give you a very effective tool to solving some of the issues we have. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Swift. Donna, do you have a comment?
I'd like to ask Mr. Swift a question. Mr. Swift, can I ask you a question?
You may. Do I have to answer?
Yes. I just want to clarify. I'm not sure if I understood what you said. If a link is deficient, a developer can come in, pay his proportionate share, and be vested. But if a link is not deficient, that developer cannot vest until he pulls building permits.
Under the current policy, referred to as a pending ordinance, which was adopted last October, someone that has absolutely no concurrency issues is stopped from moving ahead with the project because he cannot vest his traffic impact fees.
Wait, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
They can move forward with their project, they just can't pull a building permit and vest, or they cannot vest until they pull their building permit.
Well, I'm going to suggest to you, Wesley, sorry.
The way I look at this is where we have the deficient links were problems that we couldn't solve. Upon us adopting some kind of Senate Bill 360, what that'll allow, it'll allow everybody to jump forward at that time and invest whoever, if they'd like. When we do reach deficient capacities, then they start doing the proportionate share. And of course, what we were faced with, or looking down the end of a gun at, is that we had some individuals that were ready to jump out there and invest, and then no other place for anybody else to go.
Does that mean that if a developer finds a piece of property where he knows he will create a deficiency on a link, he would purchase that before he would purchase a piece of property where he knew he would create no deficiencies, because he could vest immediately upon paying his proportionate share?
After this is implemented, 360 is implemented, it really shouldn't make a difference.
No.
That's not true.
Why? Well,
Provided we amend the current vesting procedure.
On the pending, exactly, yes. Because right now, you cannot vest till building permit. Right. And the reason why is because we're running short on concurrency.
And the reality
this gives you an alternate route of creating concurrency.
Right.
I think Donna's
And
point.
when I said that you couldn't go forward, I'm speaking of a larger project that has a large requirement investment up front for off-site improvements, infrastructure, amenities. Those kinds of projects are not going to go forward. Smaller ones, 10, 20-acre subdivisions without those kinds of amenities and off-site improvements, you could take some risk that you may or may not be able to pull the building permit, sell that lot some point down the road. But you're not going to get a large master plan community with significant upfront costs for infrastructure, amenities, and off-site improvements. It's just not bankable.
The way I look at this is I think without this Senate Bill 360 in place, it does I view it exactly opposite almost. And the fact that is that we lift the pending ordinance, we have developers ready to come in right now and take up the capacity instantly. And then the only way for another development that might not be as far along in the process to be able to vest is through Senate Bill 360.
Well, I think we're saying the same thing, Leslie. The 360, the proportionate share, resolves the issues that several of the commissioners had with taking up the capacity and then not having any resolution for the next guy coming down the road.
Exactly.
So this solves that.
Yes.
So I'm just saying, let's take the solution to the problem that's presented to you with the proportionate share, link that to the pending ordinance, modify that so it makes sense, so that the unintended consequence that Ms. Keyes pointed out to, where a property that creates a problem,
right,
it may be more valuable than one that doesn't have a problem.
And upon doing that, I venture to say you'll have less people stepping up and wanting to pay their impact fees all at once now that they know there's a alternative option.
Could be. I don't know.
Mr. Bruce, Mr.
Then it becomes a business decision.
Sure.
Thank you. I didn't answer your question, but he did. Is that okay?
I think it's,
No, you answered my question. I think what we're going to see is a lot of traffic consultants now trying to make links fail rather than trying to make links work. And so I don't know if this is going to be good or bad.
but wait a minute.
Rules of the game.
Wait, no, there is one point here, and that is that, go back to the 10-lot issue. If you start out with something that's passing and you start failing, you can still go prop share midstream.
Yeah.
So,
Right, that's what 360 solves a lot of problems.
On concurrency. Yeah.
Keep in mind the problems that I think some of us see are triggered only with the optional provision. The mandatory provision, I don't think raises these issues.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. Mr. Swanson.
Jerry Swanson, 3001 Ocean Drive. Just a couple of comments. And I don't know whether I'm more confused or less confused now. However, I thought Mark Brackett had a great idea to build the road from 13th Street Southwest to 5th Street Southwest. And I offered to help him because I have a project, and whether you know it or not, there are commercial projects also going on in Indian River County. And they're also generating trips. But I was told that his trips only gave him capacity, by building that road, it only gave him capacity for, and not entirely his whole project, just part of your project. Is that right? So I said, well, I'll do a developer agreement with, after talking to Chris Mora, that I'll widen the road from 5th Street Southwest to 1st Street Southwest on 27th Avenue, and that will give us the capacity that we need to do a commercial project at 27th and Oslo. And Andy Beindorf, who has been in front of you guys and ladies, he would join along with a veterinarian, and we get the road built and we get the capacity. So I got the form and I went in to see Will, and I was told at that point, better wait. Let's 360, this ordinance is going to pend, and let's see what happens there. But in the meantime, my traffic consultant called me and said, don't agree to sign that agreement to widen the road from 5th Street to 1st, because it's failing at 4th, between 4th and 8th, 27th Avenue. So even if you widen the road, you can't get the capacity. You're going to be stopped from doing your project. Makes no sense to me, but the fact is that this ordinance, I believe, will eliminate that. Will it not, Bob?
Yeah, it has the potential to. It has the potential to if you enter into a prop share agreement for the link between 4th and 8th. And since that's not on the CIP right now, the board would have to agree to do that. But that is a potential solution.
The other, in January, we came to a meeting here at the County Commission about roads, and we're basically told that the developer community had to build US 1 from 26th Street, Airport Boulevard, to 512, because it wasn't in the comp plan. It wasn't in the 5-year CIP, and you're telling us this morning most of the roads are taken care of, but US 1 isn't one of them. And we're talking $60 or $100 million worth of road improvements. Now, to say that most of the roads are taken care of, I think is maybe misleading, because
I think that, if I could just...
Because I personally have 4 projects, not before the commission yet, or not before planning and zoning, but we've purchased land based on the fact that we're going to go forward with those commercial projects, and we have no capacity. Or if someone gets another trip, we're all going to be on US 1 from the hospital. Some of these are hospital projects, all the way to 512. We're going to be out of business. Now, all due respect to Donna, I can't see myself going out and buying a piece of property to make a trip go bad. We're trying to make these things happen. We're trying to help the infrastructure situation. We're trying to help the road capacity. It seems like it's common sense to me. If you do a bank at 27th and Oslo, you're going to take capacity off those roads that are now going to 60 to do their banking. Where does the common sense come in this? I'm really concerned that we're losing all of the common sense aspect of it.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah. One other thing I want to say is, while concurrency is used to be counted differently and funny in many areas of the state, seems to me you can count concurrency if you want no growth, period. You can count it a different way. So that's all I have to say. Do you have any?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just to respond. Mr. Swanson, the US 1 issue, the problem with that is it's not on our 5-year plan, but it's not on our 5-year plan because of the feasibility side of it. We don't have the money for it.
I understand.
And that's why we could put it on the 5-year plan, but more importantly, the US 1 is not a road, is a road that we do not have jurisdiction over like we do a county road. We are, it's very similar to some of those SIS programs that Mr. Keating had mentioned. So the only way for us to get that done will be, or the only way to allow you to move forward will be through Senate Bill 360.
Absolutely, and that's why I say it gives us a tool.
Am I wrong?
No, I don't. I don't think we're going necessarily. They don't even have to get to 360 if a bunch of developers go into one of those 5-year agreements.
Cost share.
And and a cost sharing, that would work.
Basically, what that would do is put it in our 5-year plan with feasibility.
And what we were talking about earlier would work if the same way we're doing with sewer lines and right now, as Mark mentioned, if we could pay our fair share, that's fine. The problem was, we can't get credit for our impact fees, and commercial projects are a little different. You pay your impact fee, and we're paying them $750,000 a lick when we get that concurrency. We're not talking about over a 5-year period. We need to vest right now. We need to pay our impact fees right now. It's not something coming in the future. So.
Jerry, I think maybe something that might be able to help you too. We did had an opportunity to talk with the Secretary of Transportation last week in Tallahassee, and you're getting back to common sense. When we all read the newspaper I agree with you, and it's kind of hard to sit up here and try to think common sense. As we read in the paper that the state of Florida is going to recondition and repave US 1 at $12.8 million. We all open the paper and go, wait a minute. This is a deficient link. Why don't we come into some type of cost sharing with the state of Florida, and whether it be us and the builders, what have you, as they come in and think that they're going to have to just repave this link, why don't we add another lane to it? And that is a possibility.
And
so those, and the state even said, we are so far behind the curve, like Indian River County, that we're going to have to do this in 67 counties maybe.
Yeah.
So it is becoming a common sense type of
And
scenario.
we as developers understand cost. I know it costs Joe, Joe and Jim to buy right away. It costs more money today. It costs more money to build roads. But we're in the same situation. We buy land. We may have held that land for 4 or 5 years, but it costs us more money too. So sitting, it only exacerbates the problem. Sure. And we need to do something now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. Should we be thinking about putting some of these deficient links on the CIP now, so that you don't have to go through the exercise when the developer comes up and spending time to get it on there?
Has to be
Actually, if we,
It has to be.
But it's,
But it
We are-
would be.
One of the January amendments that we're bringing through the comp plan amendment process is a complete update of the capital improvements element in the CIP's part. By the way, I think you all know we're also a pilot community with the state for preparing a capital improvements element under 360, the new regulations there. But again, the challenge is making sure that it's financially feasible and having the money to do it. But I do want to maybe allay.
Wait there a minute. Financially feasible, maybe not to us, but to some developer would be. Can't that be worked together to say, well, even though we're not thinking about it, the developer might, because it's a growth area?
Yes, we could. What we'd have to show is, I think you'd have to show you had a commitment, and you could plug that in as another revenue source on that side. You'd have to have a written commitment and an agreement in place, I believe, to make that work.
Because I hear 27th Avenue and US 1, and it's obvious that there need to be something done with it.
And we're going to be discussing this in a lot more detail when we bring the comp plan amendments forward. We're going to be bringing those to Planning and Zoning Commission March 23rd, and then the board probably a month later. But while I'm talking here, let me allay some of Mr. Swanson's concerns. Actually, most of the US 1 links are looking pretty good. There are just a couple that are really in a precarious situation. But we've got, on a lot of them, we have several hundred peak hour directional trips, which is really quite a bit of capacity.
Yeah.
with the number of entities wanting to come forward and invest now, are we still looking good?
Except on a few links. There are a few links that are problematic, and Chris can address these.
But they can't conform or invest under our pending ordinance right now, so remember that.
Right.
Right.
Okay, anyone else, like Mr. Paladin? Sure. Well, Bob Johnson, I'm sorry, he had his hand up a while ago.
Bob Johnson, Corwin Subdivision. I think it's great at the local level that Mr. Swanson and Mark can work together. I don't see myself, I've read this document, I've sat in all these meetings, and I don't see myself what is exactly broken that we're trying to fix. I do see where we have a second problem, and that is the future costs because of the inflation, the taxes that we could have in the future. So my recommendation would be that it looks like the state is coming down on the county and imposing a situation that really we don't have in this county. We do have already existing workable system in place. And I would recommend that we, since we have plenty of time, that we go back to the state, the county go back to the state, and ask to be exempt from implementing the prop share provision of 360.
I don't think they're going to do that.
Mr. Swanson and Mark can work together, and a lot of these, what we've discussed this morning, are complexities and confusion with existing ordinances that will have to be resolved in the future. We've just spent, 2 years working on the future plan for the long-range plan for 2030. And I think that, and we also have confusion as to how credit impact fee is going to be determined. And lastly, I would like to see, it looks like at another meeting, that we take examples which already exist in our county, like 27th Avenue, and ask the county staff to work out one of these examples on exactly what that would do in that particular situation. We do have an example, a live example in the county, 27th Avenue, that we could apply and see what the impact would really be. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you, Commissioner Newberg, Chairman Newberg, excuse me, members of the commission. Nancy Offit, representing the Treasure Coast Builders Association. Just a couple of observations, please. That, as I say, impact fees are collected to add capacity for new growth. They cannot be used to cure deficiencies. Proportionate share can and must be used for repairing deficiencies to the extent that the county feels that the new development is appropriate to occur. If the county would use the collected impact fees and go on its road program in an ambitious fashion, I think that fewer of these deficiencies would be occurring. So we encourage you to go forward with that. I also want to applaud Gary Wheeler for his comment in recognizing the tremendous investment that horizontal infrastructure costs, and for suggesting a longer period of time so that those who make that financial investment and providing initial infrastructure can be paid back. And on the pending, just since other people have mentioned the pending ordinance, right now we're going from one extreme where there's just the twinkle in the eye of what a development might be, a project could be, to the other extreme of requiring them to wait until they can pull a building permit. There has to be something in the middle. I think we all know that. It's just, and I think that Mr. Cox's suggestion, and I know it's been posed by others, is that when you do have a project that you feel confident you can bring and get support, get it approved, that's when you should be able to vest. And then your risk is in the engineering studies ahead of time, but not in providing the very costly infrastructure. So thank you, and thank you for taking the time to try to understand what's a very complex issue.
It is that. Thank you, Ms. Offit. Mr. Paladin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the luxury of coming up here twice. I'm going to make a brief comment on the pending ordinance that I support. And I think that we all agreed back when we worked on this pending ordinance that we didn't jump up and down and say, brilliant, that this is the most brilliant idea that ever came across our minds. This was basically a reaction to an action. It was a reaction to what was happening around us. Now, in all due respect to Mr. Ernie Cox, who represents his clients, under certain circumstances, back at that period of time, without Senate Bill 360 even on the horizon at that time, if we let anybody vest who was fighting to vest at that point, because a commodity was created for vesting, in all due respect, anybody of any intelligence that didn't have that commodity suggested wouldn't spend millions of dollars ahead of time just to help the county. It's obviously just because we had a need. We created a need. If we let maybe two of Mr. Cox's clients vest, and I don't know who all of his clients are, there could be a possibility that you'd have the other three up here the following week filing charges or a lawsuit against the county or speaking to the county negatively about not being able to vest because there was no concurrency. And that argument could be a lot easier made under reverse condemnation, because the county didn't have capacity available to buy. Now, take the bank, take Mr. Swanson, take other people that are members of this community who have been developing here for a long time. By one person, take for instance vesting that did transpire, and I'm not complaining about it. Millstone Landing invested on 27th Avenue, taking up all the concurrency on 27th Avenue. If we would have had that ordinance in effect before Millstone Landing vested, there would be concurrency on 27th Avenue for other projects as far as the Indian River National Bank to go forward. With the Senate Bill 360, once it's adopted, this puts a whole new light on things, and we have to revisit that. But at this particular time, I bring forward to you that we shouldn't even look at the pending ordinance. It's doing what it's supposed to do. It's doing what we asked it to do. It's doing what I want it to do. And it's doing what you all set it forth to do, is to let business go on forward as much as possible at this time with the amount of concurrency that we have. And like Wesley said, this ordinance doesn't keep anybody from going forward. It's letting you go forward with your project. It's just not letting you vest at an early stage. And we've heard a lot of arguments here that, well, maybe we should vest at LDP, we should vest here, we should vest, and all those are great arguments. But let me remind you, you can't change anything to any one of those arguments without a pending ordinance. So you're in the hot seat regardless. You can't decide that you want to go ahead and say, well, because a certain person has a product in the ground and he's at LDP or after LDP or whatever, let's change it to that. You can't just do that. You would have to do another pending ordinance. So, none of that makes any sense. I think what we did protects the vast amount of people in the county. As far as not being able to go forward, I mean, you're going to hear arguments, and they're meaningless. Like I said, until the Senate Bill 360 is approved and we see what we approve. We don't know what we're going to approve yet or what's going to come through, and that's why we're having this workshop. Banks not letting people go forward, I know you're going to hear arguments about that, but until this is brought to the light, no bank ever asked if you vested your concurrency before they give you a loan to do development. And even now, if you do it now and the banks are aware of it, I can tell you right now, my bank's still going to loan me money because they loan it on the strength of the client. If you can afford to pay the money back, they don't give a damn if you have concurrency or not. So, I mean, these are plain facts. So don't feel that you've gone in the wrong direction or anything, and don't feel that this is the end of all evils. It's not. And I'll be more than willing to cooperate with anything in the future once we see what we've adopted through Senate Bill 360. Any questions? If not, I'll sit down. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further comments from the audience on 360? Yes, sir.
My name is David Etter. I live in Castaway Cove on the island. I guess I have a question first for Bob. Could you briefly describe the de minimis provisions in this?
The de minimis provisions that we have essentially designate lots that were created prior to 1990 as de minimis. So any lots that were created prior to 1990 are de minimis, so essentially they're not subject to concurrency. Starting at 1990, when we adopted the plan and started applying concurrency, every developer was on notice that he was going to be subject to concurrency. He had the option of paying his impact fees up front, and every single plat where the impact fees were not paid has a plat note that the developer essentially took the risk of not being able to build because he didn't vest early. So that's the reason for the de minimis before 1990 and not after.
So basically, there is no de minimis now for developers coming into it.
Right. Not for developers. There's a de minimis just for single-family lots created before 1990.
Okay. We've been thinking about that a little bit. We have a development that has a conceptual PD approval. We hired our traffic consultant. He said, okay, you have concurrency everywhere in traffic. You can go to P&Z for preliminary PD. We filled out everything. About a day later, due to 3 trips about 5-6 miles away from our project that we impact in Indian River Boulevard link, they failed. And then they came back on. Then they failed. And in about a month period, we had concurrency, we didn't have concurrency. We had concurrency, we didn't have concurrency. For 3 trips in an area where it gets confusing to me how we can even see we'd impact it. And as I think about these provisions going to the future, let's say I'm a builder and I buy a lot from Joe, and I want to build a house, and I have one failed link way down the road. As a single developer, or as a builder for one lot, it's virtually impossible for me to justify the expense of hiring a traffic consultant, negotiating with the county, trying to enter into an agreement, paying my lawyer for it and everything else. It probably increases the cost for my house of about $10,000 based on what I've been paying attorneys and traffic consultants now. So it would be really nice if in working with the county's traffic department there could be de minimis provisions, particularly when you start getting miles and miles away for smaller projects, particularly as DRI impacts come in. And our concurrency disappeared when Devasta wanted to open up another section, and then the city of Vero Beach changed things. So it would be great if there could be de minimis, and there could also be, I listened to Joe about vesting, and Joe, I'd love for you to come in as an equity investor and provide us $6.5 million worth of cash so we can build our infrastructure, knowing there's going to be failed links coming down the road and we can't build a house. Our banks look at us, and our banks say, okay, you're a strong borrower, we'd love to loan you the money. We're not loaning you $6.5 million unless you know you can build a house and pay us back through that project. And it becomes a very real issue to smaller local builders.
Mr. Keating, Senate Bill 360, I mean, what time frame are we looking at for approving of this coming back before the commission to approve it to help relieve some of the pressures that people are affected with on US 1?
Actually, I'm glad you asked me that question. I was going to try to get it in before we left today. We actually have this advertised and scheduled to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission at its meeting on March 9th. So generally what we do is we would be bringing it to the board about a month later, because we try to wait until we have minutes of the P&Z meeting that y'all can review. So we would be looking at mid-April bringing it to you. And if I don't get a chance to say anything else, I do want to encourage people here that it's going to be over a month before it gets to the board. If anyone has any comments, any suggestions, any recommendations, call any of us, Hassan, Stan, or me. Email us. We'd be happy to discuss this with anyone or take anyone's recommendation. Then one more while I got the floor. The last comment about de minimis, one of the components that the traffic consultant is looking at is really a project's overall impact. How far out does it go? Should we be looking at 5% of project traffic? So that will be an issue that you will be able to discuss when the traffic consultant weighs in with his report.
Thank you. Anything further? Yes.
Just to go back on the pending ordinance, that is nothing more than a short-term solution to a long-term problem. And I believe upon us getting this passed, getting it through the P&Z, at that point, your bank should be able to loan you the $6.5 million to move forward without you having to put any money out to secure impact fees or to secure credits, because it will give you the opportunity through our Senate bill, through this, to provide concurrency for your project. And I mean, what we're going through right now is going to make things better in the long run for you. At the same time, addressing the road capacity needs for the citizens of the community.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Chairman, one quick comment. Based on what this gentleman just said, he doesn't have concurrency to vest right now, whether we didn't have the pending ordinance or not. So even without the pending ordinance, he couldn't vest because the concurrency isn't there.
But I think they did at one time. Remember him saying that it was available, not available, available, not available?
In the last month, we've had it last 2 months, we've had it 2 or 3 times, and we've lost it 2 or 3 times.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
May I ask a question on
Gage,
that?
yes, you may.
On Mr. Etter's project, did I hear him say he's 3 trips over on a link?
Mr. Eder?
Does that mean if he builds 3 less homes, he can build the rest of his project?
Mr.
No?
Eder, would you like to?
It's a commercial.
Is that what you said? 3 links?
It's commercial? I'm sorry.
Donna, this is the Mondola Club project that was approved by the Board of County Commissioners April 17th, but when you start getting farther and farther away from a project, your impact on the roads gets less and less, and this is, I don't know, I'll have to measure it, probably 5-6 miles away from our project, where our 90 homes has an impact of 3 trips out of, I don't know, Chris, probably 1,800 on the intersection, and just throws us over.
Right, it was very close. He's talking about the segment of Indian River Boulevard between State Road 60, or the Barber Bridge, and 21st Street, or Miracle Mile. That segment of road has been very close to capacity, and what has been causing it to go in and out of deficient status is that we've been updating our traffic counts, applying the correct seasonal factors, and it's possible for someone to look rosy one day and then deficient the next. But that has been an issue with his project for several months now.
Yeah, we've submitted.
No, the question is, if he reduced his project by 3 units or by a certain number, he could still build his project until he got concurrency on that one link.
Yes, we're looking at what we call significance, and he's significant on that link because he has a certain amount of traffic. You're correct. If he were to reduce it and no longer be significant on that piece of Indian River Boulevard, then he wouldn't have a concurrency problem.
But 5 miles away, 3 units of 3 traffic trips is not equal to 3 units of development.
Right.
I think that's what Donna's saying. Donna, that may be true in the entrance of the subdivision, but 5 miles away, 3 units of a trip, or 3 trips on a link may be the equivalent to how many units? Maybe 50 units almost.
Yeah.
Can I?
I see your point.
Yes, who? Mr. Eder, you had something else?
I'm
No?
done, thank you.
Okay, Chris? All right, anyone? Mr. Chris?
Can I ask Commissioner Davis a question?
Certainly.
How do you see this 360 curing a situation like was just discussed on Indian River Boulevard? You would have to commit to put Indian River Boulevard into the 5-year plan.
Or have the alternative that we're talking about be put into the 5-year plan where it comes across the relief canal over to US 1, something to increase or either increase the capacity there or decrease the traffic flow that's in that segment.
If we're talking about Indian River Boulevard, you would have to agree next year, at the next annual review, to put it in the 5-year plan.
No, because right now there's some information or studies coming about as far as it coming through across the country club area, and so that wouldn't affect Indian River Boulevard. In fact, what we're doing, instead of increasing capacity there, we're actually finding an alternative route, and it'd have to be one of those 2 plans, though. That is a correct statement.
Some road would have to go in.
Absolutely.
Gary's leaving. Well, he said he had another appointment earlier. Yes, sir.
Excuse me. Richard Bialowski, Oyster Shell Lane, Vero Beach. What I want, to me, it's like the pending ordinance is musical chairs, and you run around until the last minute and hope you get a seat when you're ready to pull the building permits. Least proportional share, if you're left standing, those that are left standing can kind of bargain to buy another chair, and I'm thinking that's how it works. But the question I have for Bob or Stan or Chris is this. At various points when we were doing Mondola Club, we were held back from going to P&Z because we didn't have concurrency early in the process. At this point, if proportionate share is available to us on another project, does that mean we can continue to move forward in the process without concern for concurrency at various approval stages and only have to deal with it at the end?
No, it's the other way around. You deal with it at the beginning, and it would keep you from having to deal with it at subsequent phases.
So we would pay for our concurrency before we have an approved project?
If you have a deficient link, yeah.
Wouldn't you like to know that before you put the infrastructure in?
Yeah, but I'd like to know you're going to approve the project before I wrote a check to fix the road.
That would be the developer's agreement approved upon the plat.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
You'd get a refund. I got it. Okay.
No.
You get a refund.
No, just joking. Now, wait a second. We're actually writing a check for a couple $1 million in order to go to a P&Z meeting and see if our project's going to be approved. Am I understanding that?
No. You can have the effective date of the agreement be the approval date of the project, but it's going to be the first approval. If you need it for a rezoning, you get a deficient link, prop share is a way for you to resolve it, but you're going to have to nail it down at that time and commit.
Well, I mean, there's a good and a bad side to it. And the good side, obviously, is the certainty, and the bad side is the money, but we'll take the certainty. Thanks.
Okay, we're reaching the end of this discussion, I think. Anyone else want to be heard? Anybody from the P&Z? Anybody from the commission? Craig Fletcher, I was waiting.
I'll make this this clear as mud, but it covers the ground. This all goes back to what is the trigger that sets off a deficiency on a link? And it's that formula that they use, the traffic formula that they use, that we're having the consultant do the study on. So while this is all very important discussion here, it all starts, we've got to get that traffic study, that formula that generates the trip links fixed. The math model that does that is an enormous key to making this whole thing work. If you don't get that math model fixed, this is a dance, you're going to go through day after day.
Chris, how is that coming? When can we expect
Well, he's
some?
coming up, if I could. I disagree with that to a certain extent because, I mean, if the traffic consultant changes the numbers, it's still going to be the numbers that we're living by with Senate Bill 360.
What happens is they have certain, in that formula, they have certain criteria, and they have an upper and lower limit. And whether or not they use the upper or lower limit is solely up to their own personal discretion.
But
and that's why.
And when we adopt that, it's still going to be those. That is the formula that, regardless of what formula that is, that's not going to change a thing here.
Yeah, well, you need. We have where one unit has already had trouble is we had a study done that allowed certain traffic studies to be gone by the way, and suddenly, magically appeared space. All of a sudden we had a lot of space. What we didn't know was also that that same study now let 2 other projects in under the wire that we had no idea about. That math model, Wesley, is one of the most important things you're gonna have to deal with. You've got to nail it down so that it doesn't have anybody's discretion of yes or no.
I agree the math model is important, but the math model does not affect this until, even if the math model were to change, then that's the new basis we go by for this.
The whole thing is whether or not you have a deficiency.
Right. And
a deficiency depends on the math model.
But
the math model is the basis
the math
for
model doesn't
everything.
affect Senate Bill 360, nor our growth, or the ordinance right here.
That's right, Wesley, but still, whether a deficiency is there or not, and whether you have to go through one of these routes, the math model is the beginning of all of it.
Well, I like the view from over here.
It's closer to me.
I think the commission is dwindling.
I can't hear him by right ears.
Yes, Chris, tell us about the traffic study.
Yes, the consultant is looking at, and Craig is correct. If you, depending on where you set that threshold of capacity, I can determine whether or not a prop share agreement would be necessary because it'll determine whether or not a link is deficient. But our consultant is looking at that. He's looking at what other counties are doing and how they're calculating capacity, and also which, I think another model is the trip distribution model, which he's looking at that too, how we do it versus how others do it. So he's going to come up with some recommendations on which is the best way.
April 17th is the deadline.
He's in day 46 of a 90-day contract, and he's struggling a little bit right now because it's about a 2-hour interview that we're putting these other counties through, and it's difficult to get someone to sit still. But we're working on that, and he's in the middle of those interviews right now. So his goal is to have that done by April 17th. Yes.
Okay. Anything further? Well, I guess we're adjourned then, if everyone's heard enough about this subject. Thank you for coming. See you all back at 2 o'clock. George, we're interested.
Yeah.